Case 1. Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah Whitehead. On the morning of January 13, 2010, identical twin sisters, Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah Whitehead, walked into their high school in Conyers, Georgia, just like any other day. Honor roll students, the 16-year-olds attended their classes, chatted with friends, and went about their routines as if nothing was wrong. But something was terribly wrong. Just hours earlier, the twins had stabbed their mother to death in the bathroom of their family home, and when the school day ended, they would return home, call 911, and pretend to discover her body for the first time. The crime would take years to unravel. The investigation would expose a toxic mother-daughter relationship, a troubled family history, and a justice system that forced a reunion no one wanted. This is the story of how two teenage girls became killers, and how they almost got away with it. Nikki Whitehead was 34 years old, a single mother raising her identical twin daughters in the Atlanta suburb of Conyers. Life hadn't been easy for Nikki. She'd had the girls when she was just 18, and for much of their childhood, the twins hadn't lived with her at all. Instead, they'd been raised by their great-grandmother, Della Frazier, in a more stable environment while Nikki struggled with her own issues. By all accounts, the twins thrived under their great-grandmother's care. Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah were bright students, Girl Scouts, and well-behaved teenagers. But in 2008, when the girls were 14, Nikki decided she wanted them back. She'd gotten into a relationship with a truck driver named Robert Head, and together they moved the twins into their home in Conyers. The reunion was a disaster from the start. Nikki and her daughters clashed constantly. The twins resented being uprooted from the only stable home they'd ever known. Nikki, for her part, struggled with the realities of parenting two teenage girls she barely knew. Arguments erupted over everything: curfews, grades, chores, respect. Friends and family members described the household as volatile, with screaming matches that sometimes turned physical. By early 2010, the situation had deteriorated so badly that the twins moved back in with their great-grandmother. For a brief period, there was peace. But the state of Georgia had other ideas. A juvenile court judge, believing that minor children belonged with their biological mother, ordered the twins to return to Nikki's custody. The forced reunification took place just weeks before the murder. The twins made their feelings clear. They didn't want to go back. Nikki didn't seem to want them back either. But the court left them no choice. On the morning of January 13, 2010, the tension that had been building for months finally erupted. The twins and their mother got into a fight in the bathroom. Exactly what sparked it, no one knows for certain. But what started as a verbal argument quickly turned violent. Nikki was a small woman, but she fought back hard. During the struggle, she bit both girls, leaving deep teeth marks on their bodies, marks that would later become critical evidence. The twins, working together, overpowered her. They beat her with a vase, shattering it against her body. Then they grabbed a knife and stabbed her repeatedly. When it was over, Nikki Whitehead lay dead on the bathroom floor, her body covered in wounds. Her daughters, just 16 years old, had killed her in a frenzy of rage and violence. But rather than call for help or confess to what they'd done, the twins made a chilling decision. They cleaned themselves up, got dressed, and went to school. They attended their classes. They talked to their friends. They acted as if nothing had happened, as if their mother wasn't lying dead in the bathroom at home. After school, the twins returned to the house. Only then did they call 911, screaming hysterically that they'd just discovered their mother's body. When police arrived, Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah were the picture of traumatized daughters. They sobbed. They wailed. They told officers they had no idea what could have happened. Investigators weren't so sure. From the beginning, something didn't add up. The house showed no signs of forced entry. There was no indication of robbery. Nikki's belongings were untouched, her purse still in the home. And the brutality of the attack suggested something deeply personal, This wasn't a random home invasion. This was rage. Detectives interviewed the twins separately. Both girls told the same story, nearly word for word. They'd gone to school that morning, they said, leaving their mother alive and well. When they returned in the afternoon, they found her dead. They had no idea who could have done this. They were just as shocked and horrified as everyone else. But investigators noticed something else. Both girls had visible injuries, scratches, bruises, bite marks. When questioned about them, the twins claimed the wounds came from a fight they'd had with each other the night before. It was a thin explanation, but without hard evidence. Police couldn't prove otherwise. For months, the case stalled. The twins were placed back in the care of their great-grandmother, and life went on. They returned to school, they grieved publicly, they attended their mother's funeral. To the outside world, they were victims of a terrible, unsolved crime. But behind the scenes, investigators kept digging. They re-examined the forensic evidence, they re-interviewed witnesses, and slowly, cracks began to appear in the twins' story. The breakthrough came in May 2010, nearly 4 months after the murder. Forensic analysts had been studying the bite marks found on both twins, marks they claimed came from fighting with each other. But dental experts determined that the bite patterns didn't match the girls' teeth. Instead, they matched their mother's. Nikki had bitten her daughters in self-defense as they killed her. Armed with this evidence, investigators brought Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah back in for questioning. This time, confronted with proof they couldn't explain away, the twins' united front began to crumble. In separate interrogation rooms, each sister blamed the other. Tasmiyah claimed Jasmiyah had started the violence. Jasmiyah insisted it was Tasmiyah's idea. Both admitted being present during the attack, but neither would take full responsibility. On May 21, 2010, police arrested both girls and charged them with murder. The story that emerged was one of shared culpability. According to investigators, the twins had worked together to kill their mother, each playing a role in the brutal attack. Whether it was planned in advance or erupted spontaneously from yet another argument remains unclear. But one thing was certain, both girls participated, and both had tried to cover it up by going to school and pretending to discover the body hours later. The case against the Whitehead twins was complicated by their age and by the nature of their defense. Their attorneys argued that the girls had been victims themselves, victims of a volatile, abusive relationship with a mother who didn't want them, and victims of a court system that forced them back into a toxic home against their will. Was this a cold-blooded, premeditated murder? Or was it a tragic culmination of years of dysfunction, resentment, and forced proximity? The legal proceedings dragged on for years. The twins, tried as adults, initially pleaded not guilty. But as the evidence mounted, the forensic proof, the inconsistencies in their stories, the damning bite mark analysis, their defense team shifted strategy. In 2014, 4 years after their arrest, Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah both accepted plea deals. They pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter rather than murder, acknowledging their role in their mother's death while avoiding the harsher sentence that would have come with a murder conviction. In February 2014, a judge sentenced each twin to 30 years in prison. At their sentencing hearing, the twins expressed remorse. They apologized to their family. They acknowledged the pain they'd caused. But even then, each sister's version of events differed slightly, each still minimizing her own role, while pointing a finger at the other. Today, Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah Whitehead are serving their sentences in separate prisons within the Georgia Department of Corrections. Tasmiyah is incarcerated at Arendelle State Prison, while Jasmiyah is held at Pulaski State Prison. The state made the decision to keep them apart, recognizing that their bond as twins was both their greatest strength and their greatest liability. After serving more than 3 years in jail before sentencing, the twins became eligible for parole consideration in 2017. but year after year their requests have been denied. Tasmiyah has a tentative parole date of March 2026, while Jasmia's is set for September 2027. Whether either sister will actually be released remains to be seen. The case left deep scars on the Conyers community and on the extended Whitehead family. Della Frazier, the great-grandmother who had raised the twins and tried to protect them, passed away in 2016, never seeing her great-granddaughters walk free. The murder of Nikki Whitehead raises difficult questions about family court intervention, parental rights, and whether the justice system truly acts in the best interests of children. Should the twins have been forced to live with a mother they didn't want to be with, in a home everyone knew was volatile? Could this tragedy have been prevented if the court had listened to the girls' pleas to stay with their great-grandmother? There are no easy answers. What is clear is that on January 13, 2010, two 16-year-old girls made a choice that destroyed multiple lives, their mothers, their own, and those of everyone who loved them. They went to school that morning as if nothing had happened, sitting in classrooms just hours after committing an unspeakable act. And when they came home, they called 911 and lied, hoping no one would ever know the truth. But the truth has a way of coming out. And for Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah Whitehead, the truth was written in the bite marks their mother left behind as she fought for her life. Case 2. Erin Caffey. In the early morning hours of March 1, 2008, Terry Caffey woke up to the sound of his bedroom door opening. He thought maybe one of his sons needed something. 13-year-old Matthew or 8-year-old Tyler sometimes had nightmares and came to their parents' room, but it wasn't his sons. It was a stranger with a gun. Before Terry could fully process what was happening, gunshots erupted. His wife Penny was shot beside him in bed. Terry felt bullets tear through his own body, his face, his shoulder, his chest. He heard his sons screaming from their rooms. He heard more gunshots. He smelled smoke. And then, as Terry lay bleeding on the floor, pretending to be dead, he heard a voice he recognized. His 16-year-old daughter Erin was outside, talking to the men who'd just murdered his family. She wasn't screaming for help. She wasn't being dragged away. She was leaving with them voluntarily. In that moment, as his house burned around him and his wife and sons lay dead, Terry Caffey realized the impossible, unbearable truth. His daughter had orchestrated this. The sweet Christian girl who sang in church every Sunday, who'd been homeschooled and raised in faith, who he'd loved and protected her entire life, she'd hired killers to murder her family. This is the story of Erin Caffey, a 16-year-old who chose a boyfriend over her family and paid killers to slaughter everyone she was supposed to love. It's the story of two young boys who died in their beds and a mother who was shot while she slept. And it's the story of a father who survived the unsurvivable and made a choice that defies understanding. He forgave the daughter who'd tried to have him killed. Terry and Penny Caffey were devoted Christians who built their lives around faith and family. They lived in a small trailer home on 20 acres of land outside Alba, Texas, a tiny rural town about 80 miles east of Dallas. Terry worked in customer service. Penny was a homemaker who homeschooled their 3 children. The family attended Miracle Faith Baptist Church, where they were active members of the congregation. Erin, their oldest child, was the church youth group president. She had a beautiful voice and regularly sang solos during services, her clear soprano filling the small church as her proud parents watched from the pews. Matthew, 13, was a typical middle schooler, into sports, video games, and hanging out with friends. Tyler, 8, was the baby of the family, still in that sweet stage of childhood where he followed his big sister around and looked up to his older brother. From the outside, the Caffeys appeared to be exactly what they were, a close-knit Christian family living a simple, faith-centered life. They weren't wealthy, but they had what mattered: faith, family, and love for each other. But in the fall of 2007, Erin met someone who would destroy everything. Charlie Wilkinson was 19 years old, a high school dropout with a troubled background. He worked at a car wash and spent his time hanging around Alba's small-town scene, which mostly consisted of teenagers looking for something to do in a place where there wasn't much to do. Erin met Charlie through friends and was immediately drawn to him. He was older, had a car, seemed exciting compared to the sheltered life she'd led. For a 16-year-old homeschooled girl whose world consisted of church, family, and her job at Sonic, Charlie represented freedom and adventure. They started dating in secret at first. Erin knew her parents wouldn't approve. Charlie was too old, didn't share their faith, and came from a completely different world than the one Terry and Penny had created for their daughter. But when Terry and Penny found out about the relationship, their concerns went beyond just age and background. They discovered Charlie's MySpace page, which was filled with profanity, references to drugs and alcohol, and content they found deeply inappropriate. They forbid Erin from seeing Charlie. They told her the relationship was over, that she was too young for a serious boyfriend anyway, and that Charlie wasn't the kind of person they wanted in her life. For most 16-year-olds, this would have been devastating, but ultimately survivable. Breakups hurt, but you move on. You find someone else. You grow up and realize your parents might have had a point. But Erin didn't see it that way. In her mind, Charlie was her soulmate. Her parents were the obstacles standing between her and happiness. And obstacles, she decided, needed to be removed. What Terry and Penny didn't know was that this wasn't the first time Erin had tried to have her family killed. Several months earlier, while dating another boyfriend, Erin had asked him to kill her parents. She wanted them out of the way, so she could be with him without restrictions, without rules, without anyone telling her what to do. That boyfriend refused. He was disturbed enough by the request to break up with her. But he didn't tell anyone what Erin had asked him to do. He didn't warn her parents that their daughter was thinking about having them murdered. If he had, Penny, Matthew, and Tyler might still be alive. Instead, Erin moved on. She found Charlie Wilkinson, and this time, when she asked someone to kill her family, she found someone who said yes. After Terry and Penny forbid the relationship, Erin and Charlie continued seeing each other in secret. They'd meet when Erin was supposed to be at work or at church events. They'd communicate through friends, and they began planning how to eliminate the obstacle between them, Erin's family. According to testimony that would later come out at trial, Erin actively participated in planning the murders. She told Charlie she wanted her parents dead so they could be together. She helped plan when the attack would happen. She drew a map of her family's home, showing where each family member slept. Charlie recruited a friend, 20-year-old Charles Wade, to help. Wade brought along his girlfriend, 18-year-old Bobby Johnson, who would serve as a lookout and getaway driver. The plan was simple and brutal. Charlie and Charles would go to the Caffey home in the middle of the night when everyone was asleep. They would shoot Terry, Penny, Matthew, and Tyler. They would set the house on fire to destroy evidence. And then they would take Erin and run away together. Erin knew exactly what was going to happen. She knew her mother would be shot in her bed. She knew her little brothers, 13-year-old Matthew and 8-year-old Tyler, would be killed. She knew her father would die, and she was okay with that, because in Erin's mind, losing her family was worth it if it meant being with Charlie. In the early morning hours of March 1, 2008, while the Caffey family slept, Charlie Wilkinson and Charles Wade drove to the family's trailer home. They were armed with guns and a samurai sword. Erin waited outside in the car with Bobby Johnson. Charlie and Charles entered the trailer and went to Terry and Penny's bedroom first. They opened the door and immediately opened fire. Penny Caffey was shot multiple times as she slept. She died in her bed, never knowing why strangers were in her home, never getting a chance to defend herself or her children. Terry was shot 5 times in the face, shoulder, and chest. He collapsed to the floor, bleeding heavily, in excruciating pain. He could hear his sons screaming from their rooms. He heard more gunshots, and in his agony and shock, he heard something that would haunt him forever. His daughter's voice outside, talking calmly with the killers. Matthew and Tyler were in their rooms. The killers went after them next. There are conflicting accounts of exactly what happened, whether the boys were shot in their beds or tried to run. What's certain is that both boys were killed. Matthew was 13 years old. Tyler was 8. The killers then doused the trailer in gasoline and set it on fire. The plan was for the fire to destroy evidence and make the murders look like a home invasion that ended in arson. With the house burning, Charlie and Charles left. They met Aaron and Bobby at the car, and the four of them drove away, leaving Terry Caffey bleeding on the floor of his burning home, surrounded by the bodies of his wife and sons. But Terry Caffey wasn't dead. Despite being shot 5 times, despite the massive blood loss and trauma, despite being in a house that was rapidly filling with smoke and flames, Terry Caffey somehow found the strength to survive. He crawled through the burning trailer. He made it outside, collapsing in the yard. A neighbor driving by saw the fire and found Terry lying in the grass, barely alive, covered in blood. Paramedics rushed Terry to the hospital, where doctors worked frantically to save his life. He'd been shot in the face. The bullet had shattered his teeth and jaw. He'd been shot in the shoulder and chest. He'd lost an enormous amount of blood. He was in critical condition, but he was alive. And as he drifted in and out of consciousness, Terry kept telling anyone who would listen, quote, "Zero." He didn't know yet that Penny was dead. He didn't know that Matthew and Tyler were gone. And he didn't know that his daughter Erin had orchestrated the entire attack. When firefighters extinguished the blaze and entered what remained of the Caffey trailer, they found 2 bodies. Penny Caffey had been shot to death in her bedroom. In another room, they found the bodies of Matthew and Tyler, both killed by gunfire. The scene was horrific. A mother and 2 children murdered in their own home in the middle of the night. And Terry Caffey, somehow still alive, was the only survivor. Police immediately began investigating. At first, they thought this might be a home invasion or a robbery gone wrong. But as they interviewed Terry in the hospital, a disturbing detail emerged. Erin was missing. Terry's first thought was that she'd been kidnapped, that the killers had taken his daughter. He told investigators to find her, to save her before something terrible happened. But investigators quickly realized something didn't add up. There was no sign of a struggle in Erin's room, no evidence she'd been forcibly taken. And when they started looking into her background, they discovered the forbidden relationship with Charlie Wilkinson. They brought Charlie in for questioning. He broke quickly, confessing to the murders and implicating Erin. He described how Erin had wanted her parents dead, how she'd helped plan the attack, how she'd waited in the car while he and Charles Wade killed her family. Charles Wade confessed as well, providing details that matched Charlie's account, and Bobby Johnson, the getaway driver, corroborated their stories. Within days of the murders, all 4 were under arrest: Charlie Wilkinson, Charles Wade, and Bobby Johnson for their roles in carrying out the killings, and Erin Caffey for orchestrating the entire thing. Terry Caffey was still in the hospital, recovering from his gunshot wounds and grieving the loss of his wife and sons, when investigators told him the truth. Erin hadn't been kidnapped. She'd planned the whole thing. The revelation shattered what little remained of Terry's world. His wife was dead. His sons were dead. His home was destroyed. And now he learned that his daughter, the girl he'd raised, loved, protected, and prayed with, had orchestrated their murders. Terry's initial reaction was denial. It couldn't be true. Erin would never do something like this. She'd been coerced, manipulated, forced to participate. But as the evidence mounted, the confessions, the testimony, the details Erin herself would later provide, Terry had to confront the unbearable truth. Erin had wanted him and Penny dead. She'd helped plan how to kill them. She'd waited outside while strangers murdered her family. The betrayal was almost worse than the physical wounds. Terry had survived being shot 5 times. He'd crawled out of his burning home. But how do you survive learning that your daughter orchestrated the murder of your family? Erin Caffey was arrested along with Charlie Wilkinson, Charles Wade, and Bobby Johnson. She was 16 years old, still legally a juvenile, but the severity of the crimes meant she would be charged as an adult. From the beginning, Erin's story changed depending on who was listening. Initially, she claimed she'd had no idea the attack was going to happen, that Charlie had acted on his own. But that story fell apart quickly. Charlie and Charles both said Erin had actively planned the murders. Then Erin claimed she'd tried to stop it, that she'd told Charlie not to go through with it, but he'd refused to listen. But again, the evidence contradicted her. Text messages, conversations with friends, the detailed planning, all of it showed Erin's active participation. Eventually, Erin settled on a narrative she maintains to this day. Yes, she was involved, but she didn't really want them dead. She claims she was manipulated by Charlie, that she was young and naive, that she didn't fully understand what would happen. But prosecutors had a different interpretation. They argued that Erin knew exactly what she was doing. She'd asked a previous boyfriend to kill her family. She'd drawn a map of the house. She'd waited outside while the killings happened. She'd left with the killers afterward. This wasn't a girl who'd been manipulated or coerced. This was a girl who'd made a calculated decision. She wanted Charlie more than she wanted her family alive. Charlie Wilkinson went to trial first. The evidence against him was overwhelming. His own confession, physical evidence from the scene, testimony from Charles Wade and Bobby Johnson. He was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. Charles Wade pleaded guilty and received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Bobby Johnson, who hadn't participated in the actual killings but had served as lookout and driver, pleaded guilty to murder and received a 40-year sentence. Erin's trial was more complicated. She was the mastermind, the one who'd wanted the murders to happen in the first place. But she hadn't pulled the trigger. She hadn't physically killed anyone. And she was 16 years old at the time of the crime. Prosecutors offered Erin a plea deal: plead guilty to murder and receive 2 consecutive life sentences with the possibility of parole. If convicted at trial, she could face death or life without parole. Erin accepted the plea. In August 2008, she stood in court and pleaded guilty to the murders of her mother, 13-year-old Matthew, and 8-year-old Tyler. The judge sentenced her to 2 consecutive life sentences. She would be eligible for parole when she's 59 years old, meaning she'd spend at least 43 years in prison for orchestrating her family's murder. The most extraordinary aspect of the Erin Caffey case isn't the crime itself, as horrific as it was. It's what happened afterward. Terry Caffey forgave his daughter. Terry had every reason to hate Erin. She'd orchestrated the murder of his wife and sons. She'd tried to have him killed. She'd destroyed his family and his life. If anyone would be justified in wanting their child to receive the harshest possible punishment, it was Terry. But Terry is a deeply religious man whose faith became even more important after the murders. As he recovered physically and emotionally, he turned to his Christian beliefs about forgiveness and redemption. He visited Erin in prison. He told her he forgave her. He asked prosecutors not to seek the death penalty for Charlie Wilkinson, though the prosecution and jury ultimately decided otherwise. And he began speaking publicly about his experience, emphasizing forgiveness over vengeance. Terry wrote a book called Terror by Night, detailing the murders and his journey toward forgiveness. He became a motivational speaker, sharing his story with church groups, conferences, and anyone who would listen. His message was simple but powerful. No matter how terrible the hurt, forgiveness is possible. To many people, Terry's forgiveness is incomprehensible. How can you forgive someone who had your wife and children murdered? How can you maintain a relationship with the person who orchestrated your family's destruction? Terry's answer is that forgiveness isn't about excusing what Erin did or pretending it wasn't horrible. It's about refusing to let hatred consume what's left of his life. It's about choosing to move forward rather than remaining trapped in anger and bitterness. Whether you find Terry's forgiveness inspiring or troubling, it's undeniably extraordinary. Erin Caffey is currently incarcerated at the Christina Melton Crane Unit in Gatesville, Texas, a state prison for women. She's now in her early 30s, having spent her entire adult life in prison for crimes she committed at 16. Erin maintains contact with her father. They exchange letters. He visits her. They talk about faith, forgiveness, and what happened that terrible night in March 2008. But their accounts of what happened still don't align. Terry believes Erin was manipulated by Charlie Wilkinson, that she was a naive 16-year-old who got in over her head. Erin herself continues to claim she tried to stop the murders, that she didn't really want her family dead, that she was coerced. But the evidence tells a different story. The previous boyfriend she'd asked to kill her parents, the active planning, the map of the house, the fact that she waited calmly outside while her family was slaughtered. Erin wanted her family dead so she could be with Charlie Wilkinson. And when she got what she wanted, when her mother and brothers were murdered, she left with Charlie without a second thought. Whether she's genuinely remorseful or simply saying what she needs to say to maintain her father's support is impossible to know. What's certain is that she won't be free until she's nearly 60 years old, if she's granted parole at all. Penny Caffey was 38 years old when she was shot to death in her bed. She was a devoted mother who homeschooled her children, a faithful Christian who centered her life around family and church. She died never knowing why strangers were in her home, never getting a chance to defend her children or herself. Matthew Caffey was 13 years old. He was entering adolescence, figuring out who he was, spending time with friends, playing sports. He had his whole life ahead of him. He was killed in his own home by people his sister had hired. Tyler Caffey was 8 years old. He was still in elementary school, still young enough to be excited about birthdays and Christmas, still looking up to his big sister and wanting to be like his older brother. He died terrified, murdered for no reason except that his sister wanted him out of the way. These three people, Penny, Matthew, and Tyler, are the real victims of this case. Their lives were stolen from them by someone who should have loved and protected them. The question that haunts this case is simply, why? Why would a 16-year-old girl orchestrate the murder of her entire family over a boyfriend? Erin had a loving family. She wasn't being abused or neglected. Her parents' strictness was normal. Forbidding a relationship with a 19-year-old high school dropout is reasonable parenting, not tyranny. Charlie Wilkinson wasn't her soulmate. He was a troubled teenager with no education and no prospects. Within a few years, Erin probably would have moved on, found someone else, realized her parents had been right. But at 16, Erin couldn't see beyond the present moment. She wanted what she wanted, and anyone standing in her way, even her own mother and brothers, needed to be eliminated. This is the danger of adolescent thinking combined with extreme selfishness. Most teenagers feel like their current relationship is the most important thing in the world. Most teenagers resent their parents' rules and restrictions, but the vast majority don't respond by hiring killers. Erin did, and that suggests something deeply wrong with her capacity for empathy, her ability to weigh consequences, or her fundamental moral framework. Mental health experts who evaluated Erin didn't find evidence of serious mental illness. She wasn't psychotic. She understood right from wrong. She simply chose wrong because getting what she wanted mattered more than her family's lives. The Erin Caffey case has been featured in numerous true crime documentaries and television programs. The combination of elements, the sweet Christian girl who sang in church, the forbidden romance, the brutal family murder, the father's miraculous survival and forgiveness, makes it compelling television. But the media attention has been difficult for everyone involved. Terry has used it as a platform to share his message of forgiveness, but he's also had to relive his trauma repeatedly. Extended family members have had to watch the murders of their loved ones analyzed and discussed publicly. And Erin herself has become a notorious figure, her teenage face forever associated with one of Texas's most horrific family murders. Charlie Wilkinson remains on death row in Texas, awaiting execution for his role in the Caffey family murders. His appeals continue, but the evidence against him is overwhelming, he confessed. He admitted to shooting Terry, Penny, Matthew, and Tyler. Whether Charlie will ultimately be executed or spend the rest of his life in prison is uncertain. Texas has a robust death penalty system, but executions are increasingly rare and appeals can last decades. What's certain is that Charlie will never be free. He was 19 years old when he murdered 3 people at his teenage girlfriend's request. He'll likely die in prison either by execution or old age. One of the most painful aspects of the Caffey case is how preventable it was. Erin had asked a previous boyfriend to kill her family. If he'd reported that to someone, anyone, intervention might have been possible. Terry and Penny knew about Charlie and forbid the relationship, but they couldn't monitor Erin every moment, couldn't prevent her from seeing him in secret. If any of several things had gone differently, Penny, Matthew, and Tyler would still be alive. But they didn't. And the Caffey family was destroyed because a 16-year-old girl valued a boyfriend more than her mother's life, more than her brothers' lives, more than anything, except getting what she wanted. Terry Caffey lives in Wills Point, Texas, not far from where his family was murdered. He remarried in 2009, finding love and companionship with a woman who helps him carry the weight of his loss. He continues to speak about forgiveness, to visit Erin in prison, and to honor the memory of Penny, Matthew, and Tyler through his work and his faith. Erin Caffey is incarcerated in Gatesville, Texas. She won't be eligible for parole until 2051, when she'll be 59 years old. Whether she'll actually be released or spend the rest of her life in prison remains to be seen. Charlie Wilkinson awaits his fate on death row. Charles Wade serves life without parole. Bobby Johnson is serving her 40-year sentence. And 3 graves in Alba, Texas, hold the remains of Penny, Matthew, and Tyler Caffey, a mother and 2 boys who died because someone they loved decided they were obstacles to be removed. Case 3. Sarah Grace Patrick. In the early morning hours of February 20th, 2024, a 6-year-old girl woke up in her home in the rural Tyus community of Carroll County, Georgia. She wandered through the quiet house looking for her parents. When she found them, they were lying motionless in their bed. The little girl didn't fully understand what she was seeing. She went to find her older sister, 17-year-old Sarah Grace Patrick, and told her something was wrong with Mommy and Daddy. Sarah called 911. When deputies arrived at the home on Tyus Road, they found 41-year-old Kristen Brock and 45-year-old James Brock dead in their bedroom, both killed by gunshot wounds. The scene was devastating. A loving couple murdered in their sleep, discovered by their youngest child, in a community where violent crime was virtually unheard of. What happened next was even more disturbing. As investigators began piecing together the evidence, Sarah Grace Patrick became the center of a bizarre public display of grief. She posted tearful TikTok videos mourning her parents. She accepted condolences from friends and strangers. She presented herself as a devastated daughter, trying to cope with unspeakable tragedy. But behind the scenes, Sarah was doing something else entirely. She was reaching out to true crime content creators on social media, asking them to cover her parents' case. She was messaging YouTubers, requesting that they make videos about the murders. And as the investigation continued, detectives began to suspect that Sarah wasn't just a grieving daughter, she was the killer. Kristen and James Brock were well known and deeply loved in the small Tyus community, about 55 miles west of Atlanta. They were active members of Catalyst Church in nearby Carrollton, where congregation members described them as the kind of people who made everyone feel welcome. Kristen was bubbly and outgoing. She loved giving hugs and never met a stranger. Friends remembered her warmth, her infectious personality, her genuine kindness. One church member recalled a moment during a Christmas parade when Kristen noticed her shoe was untied and stopped to tie it for her, a small gesture that captured who Kristen was as a person. James had a different personality. He was the funny one, always cracking jokes, always trying to make people laugh. But beneath the humor was a man dealing with serious health issues. James had already undergone multiple heart surgeries and was waiting for a heart transplant. Despite his condition, he remained positive, leaning on his faith and his family to get him through. Together, Kristen and James had children from previous relationships, including Sarah Grace Patrick, Kristen's daughter from an earlier relationship, and a 6-year-old daughter they were raising together. But Sarah's relationship with her mother and stepfather had been complicated for years. She hadn't always lived with them. Instead, she'd moved between various family members, living in different homes, never quite settling. Family members later described her as someone who struggled with stability, someone who had behavioral issues that concerned those around her. Still, no one could have imagined what was coming. The 911 call came in early on the morning of February 20th. When deputies from the Carroll County Sheriff's Office arrived at the Brock home on Tyus Road, they found a scene of unimaginable horror. Kristen and James had been shot while they slept. Their 6-year-old daughter had found them and alerted Sarah, who then called for help. Investigators immediately began processing the scene. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. The house was quiet, undisturbed, except for the bedroom where 2 people had been executed in their sleep. The crime scene told a story of cold-blooded murder. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This wasn't a home invasion. Someone had walked into that bedroom and shot Kristen and James Brock while they were at their most vulnerable, asleep in their own bed. And then that same person had left the house, knowing that a 6-year-old child would wake up and find her parents dead. The investigation began immediately, but it would take months of painstaking work to build a case. The Carroll County Sheriff's Office called in the FBI and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation Crime Lab. They sifted through mountains of physical and digital evidence. They interviewed family members, friends, neighbors, anyone who might have information. And all the while, Sarah Grace Patrick was posting on social media. In the days and weeks following her parents' deaths, Sarah became active on TikTok and other platforms, posting videos of herself crying, grieving, struggling to process her loss. To anyone watching, she appeared to be a heartbroken teenager trying to cope with the sudden, violent deaths of her mother and stepfather. But Sarah was doing something else too, something that would later strike investigators and the public as deeply disturbing. She was reaching out to true crime content creators, asking them to cover her parents' case. She messaged the creator of a true crime page called Quote Ciaro, which had nearly 120,000 followers. In her messages, Sarah asked the creator to quote one. She wanted the murders featured. She wanted attention on the story. The creator was immediately suspicious. Why would a grieving daughter be trying to get her parents' murder case onto true crime channels just days after they'd been killed? The creator shared screenshots of the messages and refused to cover the case, sensing something was very wrong. Other TikTok users began noticing the same pattern. Sarah was everywhere, posting tearful videos about missing her parents while simultaneously seeking out true crime coverage. The performance felt off. The grief seemed calculated. And people started asking questions. One person commented on the dissonance between Sarah's public mourning and her private behavior. She was presenting herself as devastated, but she was also actively trying to turn her parents' deaths into content, into a story, into something that would generate views and attention. It was a level of manipulation and narcissism that was hard to comprehend. And it made investigators look at Sarah more closely. For months, the Carroll County Sheriff's Office worked the case quietly. They analyzed physical evidence from the scene. They examined digital footprints. They tracked movements and communications. They spoke to family members who described Sarah's troubled history, her instability, her behavioral problems. Slowly, a picture emerged. This wasn't a random killing. This wasn't an intruder. The evidence pointed to someone inside the house, someone who knew Kristen and James, someone who had access to them while they slept. The evidence pointed to Sarah. On July 8, 2024, nearly 5 months after the murders, the Carroll County Sheriff's Office held a press conference. They announced that an arrest had been made. Sarah Grace Patrick, now 17 years old, had been charged as an adult with 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of aggravated assault. Sheriff's Office spokesperson Ashley Halsey addressed the media, her voice heavy with the weight of the case. She said, she described the months of relentless investigation, the thousands of hours spent analyzing evidence, the collaboration with federal law enforcement agencies. She also spoke about the victims, about Kristen, who had loved life and loved people, about James, who had already endured so much with his heart condition, who had fought through multiple surgeries, who was waiting for a transplant that would give him a chance to live. Quote, Tree. Halsey said, quote, and then Halsey mentioned the youngest victim, the 6-year-old girl who had woken up that February morning and found her parents dead, the child who would carry that image with her for the rest of her life. Sarah was arrested and charged. The investigation, however, was far from over. Authorities indicated they were looking into potential accomplices, suggesting that Sarah might not have acted alone. But as of now, she remains the only person charged in connection with the murders. The arrest sent shockwaves through the Tyus community. This was a quiet, rural area where people knew their neighbors, where violent crime was rare, where something like this simply didn't happen. Members of Catalyst Church struggled to process the loss. Kristen and James had been pillars of their congregation, people who served others, who showed up, who made a difference in people's lives. Church member Tasha Meza spoke about the couple's warmth and humor. Another member, Jonan Daniel, recalled how Kristen had stopped during a parade to tie his shoe, a small act of kindness that spoke to her character. The community had rallied after the murders, holding vigils, calling for justice, hoping that whoever had done this would be caught. But learning that the killer was allegedly their own daughter added a layer of horror that was almost impossible to comprehend. Family members were torn apart. Some couldn't believe Sarah was capable of such violence. Others weren't surprised, pointing to her behavioral issues, her instability, her troubled relationship with her mother and stepfather, and everyone asked the same question. Why? Why would a teenage girl shoot her mother and stepfather while they slept? What could possibly drive someone to that level of violence? The answer, if there is one, will have to wait for trial. As of now, Sarah Grace Patrick remains in custody, awaiting trial. She has been charged as an adult with 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of aggravated assault. If convicted, she faces life in prison. The investigation is still active. The Carroll County Sheriff's Office has indicated they're pursuing leads and evaluating whether additional arrests will be made. The suggestion is that Sarah may have had help, that someone else may have been involved in planning or carrying out the murders, but the details remain sealed. The evidence is protected, and the public is left with questions that won't be answered until the case goes to trial. What is known as this: Kristen and James Brock were killed in their sleep. Their 6-year-old daughter found their bodies, and their teenage daughter posted tearful videos on social media while simultaneously trying to get true crime creators to turn her parents' deaths into content. It's a level of calculated deception that's hard to fathom. Whether it was part of covering up her crime or simply a disturbing response to tragedy, it revealed something deeply wrong. Among all the heartbreaking details of this case, one stands out with particular cruelty. James Brock had fought so hard to stay alive. He'd survived multiple heart surgeries. He'd endured the physical and emotional toll of waiting for a heart transplant. He'd maintained hope, leaning on his faith, his family, and his community to get him through. He was on a list, waiting for a donor, waiting for a second chance at life. And just when he needed his health to hold out a little longer, just when he was fighting to make it to that transplant, someone walked into his bedroom and shot him while he slept. James Brock wasn't given a second chance. His life wasn't cut short by his heart condition. It was stolen from him by an act of violence in his own home. The same is true for Kristen. She was vibrant, full of life, loved by her church community, devoted to her family. She should have had decades ahead of her. Instead, she was murdered in the place where she should have been safest, in her own bed, next to her husband, in the home they'd built together. And their youngest daughter, just 6 years old, will spend the rest of her life remembering the morning she found them. As we wait for Sarah Grace Patrick's trial, the questions pile up. What was her motive? Was she angry at her mother and stepfather? Was there conflict in the home? Did she resent them? Was she influenced by someone else? And perhaps most disturbingly, why did she post those TikTok videos? Why reach out to true crime creators? Was it an attempt to control the narrative, to appear innocent by performing grief? Or was it something darker? A desire for attention, for notoriety, for her story to be told on a platform she consumed herself? The answers will come eventually, but they won't bring Kristen and James back. They won't erase the trauma their youngest daughter experienced. They won't heal the community that lost two beloved members. What this case does reveal is the disturbing intersection of violence and social media, of murder and performance, of grief as a tool for manipulation. Sarah Grace Patrick allegedly killed her parents and then turned their deaths into content, into a story she wanted told, into something she could control and shape. It's a new kind of horror for a digital age, and it leaves us asking, how much of what we see online is real? How much is performance? And when does the line between victim and villain become impossible to see? Case 4. Cassandra Bjorga. On April 8, 2017, police in Gwinnett County, Georgia, made a welfare check at a 2-story suburban home on Furlong Run in Lawrenceville. Neighbors had reported a foul smell coming from the residence. No one had seen the homeowners, 63-year-old Wendy and Randall Bjorga, in over a week. Their car sat in the driveway. The lights were off. No one answered the door. When officers finally entered the home, the scene that greeted them was one of calculated horror. Wendy and Randall Bjorga were dead in their bedroom, their throats slit, their bodies in advanced stages of decomposition. The bedroom doors had been caulked shut from the outside in a crude attempt to contain the smell of death. And the evidence suggested they'd been dead for at least a week. But the most disturbing detail was this. Their 17-year-old granddaughter, Cassandra, and her 19-year-old boyfriend, Johnny Ryder, had spent that entire week living in the house, partying with friends, smoking marijuana, and going about their lives as if the bodies decomposing in the sealed bedroom were nothing more than an inconvenience to be managed. This is the story of a teenage girl who murdered the grandparents who raised her, then celebrated their deaths by turning their home into a party house while their bodies rotted just feet away. Wendy and Randall Bjorga had opened their home to their granddaughter Cassandra when she needed stability. They'd taken her in, given her a place to live, tried to provide structure and support. By all accounts, they were kind, loving grandparents, doing their best to help a troubled teenager. But Cassandra didn't see it that way. She resented their rules. She chafed against their expectations. She wanted freedom to do what she wanted, when she wanted, and her grandparents stood in the way. The relationship had been volatile for years. Police had been called to the Furlong Run home multiple times. Cassandra had a pattern of running away, disappearing for days or weeks at a time, then returning when she needed food, shelter, or money. Wendy and Randall took her back every time, hoping that eventually she'd settle down, mature, appreciate what they were trying to do for her. But the conflicts only escalated. In November 2016, just 5 months before the murders, Cassandra got into a physical altercation with Wendy. According to Officer J.C. Guevara's report, the argument started over Cassandra's behavior, her pattern of staying out late, her disrespect toward her grandmother. The confrontation turned physical. Cassandra struck Wendy multiple times. When police arrived, Wendy had a small red mark on her left arm, though she didn't report any serious injuries and didn't want to press charges. But the incident was documented. Cassandra, then 16, was charged with simple battery, simple assault, and being an unruly juvenile. A juvenile complaint form was forwarded to the courts. It was a warning sign, a clear indication that the relationship between Cassandra and her grandparents had become dangerous. But no one could have predicted just how dangerous it would become. In early 2017, Cassandra began dating 19-year-old Johnny Ryder. Like Cassandra, Johnny had a troubled background. He lived with his father and stepmother, seeing his biological mother only once or twice a year. His relationship with his family was strained, marked by conflict and resentment. Wendy and Randall didn't approve of the relationship. They didn't like Johnny. They didn't want him staying at their house, didn't want him around Cassandra. But the more they tried to keep the couple apart, the more Cassandra pushed back. Johnny, for his part, encouraged Cassandra's resentment toward her grandparents. According to later testimony, he talked about wanting to hurt them, wanting them out of the way. And Cassandra listened. Sometime in early April 2017, Cassandra and Johnny began planning the murders. They discussed when to do it, how to do it, what weapons to use. They talked about it openly, casually, as if they were planning a weekend trip rather than a double homicide. And then, on a night in early April, they put their plan into action. The exact date of the murders isn't entirely clear, but investigators believe it happened around April 1st or 2nd, 2017. What is clear is how it happened. Cassandra and Johnny waited until Wendy and Randall had gone to bed. The grandparents, trusting that their granddaughter and her boyfriend were somewhere else in the house, fell asleep without any idea of what was about to happen. Johnny entered Randall's room first. He attacked the 63-year-old man with a tire iron, beating him brutally. Randall, caught by surprise and overpowered, didn't stand a chance. Johnny then turned to other weapons, a hammer, a knife. The attack was savage, relentless, designed not just to kill, but to obliterate. At some point during the assault on Randall, Cassandra went after Wendy. According to Detective Dave Bruce's later testimony, Cassandra said she, quote, zero quote. She dragged her grandmother into Randall's bedroom. Wendy was duct-taped, restrained, helpless. And then the couple finished what they'd started. Both Wendy and Randall had their throats slit. Both were stabbed multiple times. Both were beaten with the tire iron and other blunt objects. The bedroom became a scene of carnage. Blood spattered across the walls and floor. When it was over, Wendy and Randall Bjorga were dead, and their granddaughter and her boyfriend had the house to themselves. Most people who commit murder try to hide the evidence, dispose of the bodies, flee the scene. Cassandra Bjorga and Johnny Ryder did something different. They stayed in the house. They lived there. They partied there. To manage the smell of decomposition, they caulked the doors to the bedroom where the bodies lay. They sealed the room as best they could, trapping the odor inside. It was a makeshift solution that wouldn't work forever, but it bought them time. Then they invited friends over. They smoked marijuana. They hung out, watched TV, raided the refrigerator. Friends who came to the house later told police they'd noticed nothing unusual. Cassandra and Johnny seemed normal, relaxed, having a good time. No one suspected that just down the hall, behind caulked doors, 2 bodies were decomposing. The couple also used Wendy and Randall's car, driving it around town as if it were their own. They helped themselves to whatever they wanted from the house. They lived as if they'd inherited the place, as if Wendy and Randall had simply moved out and left everything behind. But the couple had bigger plans. According to investigators, Cassandra and Johnny weren't finished killing. They had a list. They planned to murder Johnny's sister and her boyfriend. They planned to kill Cassandra's mother. They discussed it openly, making preparations, deciding who would be next. On April 8th, they made their move. They drove to the home of Johnny's sister, Mindy. What happened next would lead to their undoing. When Johnny and Cassandra arrived at Mindy's house, they didn't come to visit. They came to kill. Johnny confronted Mindy about items that had gone missing from her room. The conversation quickly escalated. Johnny sprayed Mindy and her boyfriend with Bear pepper spray, temporarily incapacitating them. Then, while they were disoriented and in pain, he began beating Mindy's boyfriend. He yelled for Cassandra to get a baseball bat. Cassandra returned with the bat and handed it to Johnny. That's when Mindy, despite being pepper sprayed, intervened. She fought back, trying to protect her boyfriend and herself. During the struggle, Johnny struck Mindy in the head with the baseball bat, but Mindy escaped. She and her boyfriend managed to get away and called police. Johnny and Cassandra fled in Wendy and Randall's car. For the first time since the murders, law enforcement had a reason to look for Cassandra Bjorga and Johnny Ryder. The attack on Johnny's sister had put them on police radar, and when officers went to the Bjorga home to follow up, they made the grisly discovery of Wendy and Randall's bodies. The timeline became clear. Cassandra and Johnny had murdered her grandparents over a week earlier, then lived in the house for days before attempting to kill Johnny's sister. The couple wasn't just dangerous. They were serial killers in the making, with a list of intended victims and a willingness to act on their homicidal impulses. When police discovered the bodies, they immediately began searching for Cassandra and Johnny. The couple had fled Gwinnett County, taking Wendy and Randall's car and whatever valuables they could grab. Investigators quickly pieced together what had happened: the caulked doors, the weapons, tire iron, hammer, baseball bat, butcher knives scattered around the crime scene, the evidence of the couple having lived in the house for days after the murders, the attack on Johnny's sister that suggested they were planning to kill again. Gwinnett County Deputy Chief Assistant District Attorney Trayson Kaysen described it as a pretty cold-blooded killing that was planned and executed correctly according to their plan. He noted that Cassandra and Johnny didn't look like what people expected serial killers to look like, but that's exactly what they were becoming. Police located and arrested both suspects. They were charged with 2 counts of murder, 6 counts of aggravated assault, 1 count of armed robbery, aggravated battery, and theft by taking. The evidence against them was overwhelming. They'd left behind DNA, fingerprints, digital evidence. Friends testified about the couple's behavior during the week they'd spent in the house. And then there were their own confessions. In separate interviews, both Cassandra and Johnny admitted to the murders, though each tried to minimize their own role while emphasizing the other's culpability. Prosecutors considered seeking the death penalty for Johnny Ryder. They believed the brutality of the crimes, the planning involved, and the couple's intention to kill more people warranted the ultimate punishment. But ultimately, both Cassandra and Johnny accepted plea deals to avoid trial. On February 2, 2018, they stood before Judge Deborah Turner in Gwinnett County Superior Court and pleaded guilty to all charges. The sentencing hearing revealed the full scope of their depravity. Prosecutors detailed how they'd murdered Wendy and Randall, sealed the room with caulk, then partied in the house while the bodies decomposed. They described the attack on Johnny's sister. They presented evidence of the couple's plans to kill additional family members. When it was Johnny Ryder's turn to speak, he delivered an extraordinary statement. Quoting scripture and religious language, he pleaded for forgiveness. Quote, 4, he said. Quote, 5. He acknowledged the evil of his actions. Quote, 6, he said. Quote, 7. It was a lengthy, emotional speech filled with religious references and pleas for mercy. Whether it was sincere or performative, only Johnny knows. Cassandra Bjorga, on the other hand, said nothing. She refused to speak. She sat silently throughout the proceedings, offering no apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement of what she'd done to the grandparents who'd raised her. Judge Deborah Turner, clearly disgusted by the case, didn't mince words. "I'm not sure I've ever imagined such a well-planned, despicable, heinous act to be committed by two such young people," she said. "The heartless and depraved nature of what the two of you did says to me, it's not worth my time." She sentenced both Cassandra and Johnny to life in prison plus 21 years, with the possibility of parole. The sentences would run concurrently, meaning they would be eligible for parole consideration after serving a significant portion of their time. Cassandra Bjorga is currently serving her sentence in a Georgia prison. She was 17 years old when she helped murder her grandparents. She's now in her mid-20s, spending her young adulthood behind bars for crimes she committed as a teenager. Johnny Ryder is also incarcerated in Georgia. His religious conversion in court didn't prevent him from receiving a life sentence. Whether his faith is genuine or simply a tool for potential future parole hearings remains to be seen. Both will be eligible for parole eventually, though there's no guarantee they'll ever be released. Their crimes were too calculated, too brutal, too devoid of remorse, at least in Cassandra's case, to inspire confidence that they've been rehabilitated. The extended Bjorga family was left to grieve not just the loss of Wendy and Randall, but the knowledge that their own granddaughter had orchestrated their murders. Family members who attended the sentencing hearing were torn between anger, grief, and disbelief. How could this have happened? How could a teenage girl kill the people who'd taken her in, who'd loved her, who'd given her a home? The case of Cassandra Bjorga and Johnny Ryder leaves us with difficult questions about warning signs, intervention, and whether some teenagers are simply beyond saving. The signs were there. Cassandra had assaulted her grandmother just months before the murders. She'd been charged with battery. She ran away repeatedly. Police had been called to the home numerous times. The relationship was clearly toxic, clearly dangerous. Could anything have prevented this tragedy? Could social services have intervened more aggressively? Should Cassandra have been removed from the home after she assaulted Wendy? Were there mental health resources that could have helped her? Or was this simply the story of a deeply disturbed teenager who, given the opportunity and the encouragement of an equally troubled boyfriend, chose violence? What we know for certain is that Wendy and Randall Bjorga tried. They took in their granddaughter. They gave her a home. They set boundaries, provided structure, and kept taking her back, even when she ran away. They loved her, even when she made it clear she didn't appreciate their efforts. And their reward was to be beaten, stabbed, and left to decompose in their own bedroom while their granddaughter partied in their house and planned to kill more people. Judge Deborah Turner was right when she called this one of the worst cases she'd ever seen. The premeditation, the brutality, the weeks spent living with the bodies, the plans to kill more people, the complete lack of remorse from Cassandra. All of it adds up to a case that challenges our understanding of teenage violence. These weren't children who snapped in a moment of rage. These weren't abuse victims striking back against their tormentors. These were two young people who coldly, calculatedly murdered two elderly people who'd done nothing but try to help, then turned the crime scene into a party house. The case serves as a grim reminder that evil doesn't have an age requirement, that teenagers can be just as calculating, just as cruel, just as capable of monstrous acts as any adult, and that sometimes no amount of love, patience, or second chances can save someone who's determined to destroy. Wendy and Randall Bjorga deserved better. They deserved to grow old together, to enjoy their retirement, to see their other grandchildren grow up. Instead, they were murdered by someone they'd tried to help, someone they'd welcomed into their home, someone who repaid their kindness with unspeakable violence. And in the end, Cassandra Bjorga couldn't even bring herself to say she was sorry. Case 5. Tara King. On the evening of February 6, 2025, deputies from the Galveston County Sheriff's Office responded to a welfare check at a home on 15th Street in Backcliff, Texas, a small coastal community southeast of Houston. The call had come from 61-year-old Tammy King's boyfriend, who said he'd been unable to reach her and was worried something was wrong. When he forced entry into the home, he found Tammy lying nude on the floor of her bedroom, a sheet covering her face. She'd been shot in the head. The house had been ransacked. Guns were missing from the bedroom safes. Tammy's purse had been emptied, and her granddaughter, 17-year-old Tara King, was nowhere to be found. What investigators would uncover over the next few days was a story of methamphetamine, manipulation, and murder. A story told through Instagram messages and Cash App transactions. A story in which a teenage girl and her 18-year-old boyfriend had killed Tammy King, not in a sudden moment of rage, but after days of planning, fueled by drugs and a hatred that Tara had been nursing for years. This is one of the most recent cases of a teenage girl murdering a family member, a crime that happened just months ago, leaving a community in shock and a legal system still working to deliver justice. Tammy King had raised her granddaughter Tara for much of the girl's life. Tara's relationship with her own parents was troubled, and Tammy had stepped in to provide stability. She opened her home in Backcliff, a working-class town along Galveston Bay, and tried to give Tara the structure and support she needed. But the relationship between grandmother and granddaughter had never been easy. According to those who knew them, there were constant arguments. Tara resented Tammy's rules, her expectations, her involvement in her life. She chafed against curfews and homework and being told what to do. Tara would later describe her grandmother to acquaintances as abusive, claiming that Tammy used drugs and mistreated her. Whether these allegations had any basis in reality is impossible to know. What is certain is that Tara used them to justify her actions, to paint herself as a victim who had no choice but to run away from her toxic home. The truth is that Tammy was trying. She was dealing with a troubled teenager, and like so many grandparents in her position, she was doing her best to keep Tara safe, enrolled in school, and on a path toward a stable future. But Tara didn't want stability. She wanted freedom. And in late 2024, she found someone who encouraged her worst impulses, 18-year-old Uriah Urick. Uriah Urick came from his own troubled background. His mother described him as suffering from anxiety, depression, and a history of self-harm. He had a history of violence. He'd threatened his stepfather and been physically abusive toward his siblings. His mother would later tell investigators something chilling. She believed her son was capable of murder. Uriah also had a drug problem. He was a regular methamphetamine user, buying from dealers and using frequently enough that it affected his behavior and his judgment. When Tara and Uriah started dating, Tammy immediately disapproved. She didn't want Uriah at the house. She didn't want him spending the night. She saw him as a bad influence, someone who would drag her granddaughter down a dangerous path. She was right. But by the time she tried to intervene, it was already too late. What makes the Tara King case particularly disturbing is the digital evidence trail. In the days leading up to Tammy's murder, Tara and Uriah were messaging each other on Instagram, discussing their plans openly, almost casually. The messages painted a picture of two drug-addled teenagers working themselves up to commit murder. On the day before Tammy's death, both Tara and Uriah appeared to be under the influence of methamphetamine. Their messages referenced the drug explicitly, and they discussed violence. Uriah wrote, "Don't want to kill her." Tara responded, "I've always hated her." Uriah, "Do I kill her next time if there is a next time?" The messages included references to stabbing and beating. They revealed emotional manipulation between the couple, with each pushing the other toward violence. And they showed premeditation. This wasn't a sudden decision made in the heat of the moment. This was something they'd been building toward, discussing, planning. Investigators also found messages in which Tara talked to friends about her grandmother. She described wanting to get away from Tammy. She complained about her living situation. And she made it clear that she felt trapped, that she saw her grandmother as the obstacle standing between her and the life she wanted. But Tammy wasn't just an obstacle. She was also a source of money. On the morning of Wednesday, February 5, 2025, Tara and Tammy got into an argument. It was a familiar conflict. Tammy wanted Tara to go to school. Tara didn't want to go. The argument escalated, voices raised, tensions boiling over. But this time, the argument didn't end with Tara storming off to her room or running away for a few days. This time, it ended with murder. Sometime that morning, Tara shot her grandmother in the head. The exact sequence of events isn't entirely clear, but investigators believe Uriah was present, possibly pulling the trigger himself or assisting Tara. What is certain is that Tammy King was killed with a gunshot wound to the left side of her head. After the shooting, Tara and Uriah ransacked the house. They opened Tammy's bedroom safes and stole several firearms. They emptied her purse. And then they did something that showed just how calculated this crime was. They accessed Tammy's bank accounts. Using Tammy's phone and Cash App information, Tara transferred 5 separate payments of $500 each to her own Cash App account, a total of $2,500. She also attempted larger transfers of $5,000 and $20,000. But those transactions failed. Investigators later discovered that an _3_ had linked a bank account to Tammy's Cash App, suggesting the couple had been planning this financial theft in advance. Tammy's bank records also showed that she'd used her credit card at a restaurant on Wednesday, the last transaction she ever made. By that evening, she was dead, and Tara and Uriah were on the run. After murdering Tammy, Tara and Uriah fled the scene with stolen guns, stolen money, and Tammy's car. They knew they needed to change their appearance, to make themselves harder to identify. Surveillance footage from a Walmart shows Tara buying hair dye with cash. She and Uriah then went to the home of Christian Atkins, an acquaintance Tara had contacted on social media asking for help. She told Atkins that she needed a place to stay because she was fleeing her for Atkins, unaware that Tammy was already dead. Let the couple stay with him. Over the next 2 days, Tara and Uriah cut and dyed their hair, attempting to disguise themselves. They tried to sell the stolen guns through Atkins's co-workers, but no one would buy them. Meanwhile, Tara was messaging other acquaintances on social media, asking for rides, asking for help getting out of Texas. She told one woman that she and Uriah were going to Dallas. She told another that she needed to get to Wyoming, Idaho, or Illinois, anywhere far from Galveston County. When one friend sent Tara a screenshot of a Galveston County Sheriff's Office Facebook post naming her and Uriah as persons of interest in Tammy's death, Tara begged her not to say anything. When asked directly if she'd killed her grandmother, Tara didn't answer. She just said they were in Dallas. But they weren't in Dallas. They were still trying to figure out how to get as far away as possible. One woman Tara contacted would later tell investigators something crucial. Tara had admitted to her that she and Uriah killed Tammy. Quote, 5. It was a stark, brutal confession, no elaborate justification, no claims of self-defense or abuse, just anger and drugs, a toxic combination that had led 2 teenagers to murder a 61-year-old woman in her own home. The same woman said Tara had also admitted to stealing money and guns from Tammy. She told investigators everything, providing crucial evidence that would later be used against both Tara and Uriah. By Friday, February 7th, Atkins realized something was very wrong. Tara and Uriah's behavior had become increasingly paranoid. They kept calling him, saying people were knocking on the door, saying the cops might be coming. When Atkins went to work and returned home, the couple had vanished, leaving their dog with a neighbor. But they'd made arrangements for their next move. They'd contacted Travis Hodge, a 35-year-old methamphetamine dealer who'd sold drugs to Uriah before. Hodge agreed to help them flee, for a price. They paid him $1,000 to drive them to Laredo, Texas, a border city where they hoped to disappear into Mexico. Hodge picked them up, stored their stolen guns in his shed, and began the drive south. On Sunday, February 9, 2025, just 4 days after Tammy's murder, law enforcement tracked Tara and Uriah to Laredo. Acting on tips and digital evidence, officers moved in and arrested both teenagers. They were extradited back to Galveston County and charged with capital murder, one of the most serious charges in Texas law. Capital murder carries only 2 possible sentences: life in prison without the possibility of parole or death. Investigators also arrested Travis Hodge during a traffic stop. They found him in possession of methamphetamine, a digital scale, and plastic baggies consistent with drug distribution. When questioned, Hodge admitted he was a convicted felon and that Tara and Uriah had given him stolen firearms. Police recovered 2 guns, ammunition, and other evidence from Hodge's storage shed. He was charged with delivery of a controlled substance, possession of a firearm by a felon, and hindering apprehension. The investigation had moved remarkably quickly. Within 4 days, law enforcement had identified the suspects, tracked their movements, recovered evidence, and made 3 arrests. The digital trail, Instagram messages, Cash App transactions, social media contacts, had made the couple easy to follow. But the hardest work was still to come: building the case for trial. In November 2025, Uriah Urick went to trial first. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence against him. There were the Instagram messages discussing murder. There was testimony from Travis Hodge, who described selling meth to Uriah and later helping the couple flee. There was the financial evidence showing the Cash App transfers from Tammy's account to Tara's. And there was the murder weapon itself, recovered from Hodge's shed. Ballistics matched the gun used to kill Tammy King. The trial lasted several days. Prosecutors painted Uriah as a violent, drug-addicted young man who had encouraged and participated in Tammy's murder. They emphasized his history of violence toward family members, his mother's statement that she believed him capable of murder, and the cold, calculated way he and Tara had discussed killing Tammy while high on methamphetamine. The defense argued that Uriah had been manipulated by Tara, that he'd been under the influence of drugs, that his mental health issues, anxiety, depression, a history of self-harm, had impaired his judgment. They tried to paint him as a troubled kid who'd made terrible choices, but didn't deserve to spend the rest of his life in prison. The jury didn't buy it. After more than 3 hours of deliberation, they returned a verdict: guilty of capital murder. Because Uriah was 18 at the time of the crime, he faced the possibility of the death penalty. But the jury opted for life in prison without the possibility of parole instead. Uriah Urick will spend the rest of his life behind bars for his role in Tammy King's murder. He will never be free again. As of now, Tara King is still awaiting trial. She remains in custody at the Galveston County Jail, charged with capital murder. Her case is complicated by her age. She was 17 at the time of the murder, making her a juvenile under Texas law. However, she's being charged as an adult, which means she faces the same potential sentences as Uriah, life without parole, or potentially even death, though the Supreme Court has ruled that juveniles cannot be executed. The evidence against Tara is just as damning as it was against Uriah. The Instagram messages show she was an active participant in planning the murder. Her own admissions to friends that she killed Tammy because she was angry and high on meth demonstrate consciousness of guilt. The Cash App transfers from Tammy's account to hers show financial motive. And then there's the statement that may be most damaging of all: "I've always hated her." Those words, typed by Tara in a message to Uriah just before the murder, reveal a depth of animosity that's hard to reconcile with claims of abuse or self-defense. They suggest that Tara had been nursing hatred toward her grandmother for a long time, that this wasn't a sudden eruption of violence, but the culmination of years of resentment. When Tara's trial begins, her defense attorneys will likely argue that she was under Uriah's influence, that she was a drug-addicted teenager who made terrible choices but deserves a chance at rehabilitation. They may try to paint Tammy as abusive, as controlling, as someone who drove Tara to desperation. But the evidence suggests something different. It suggests that Tara King made a calculated decision to kill her grandmother, steal her money and guns, and flee toward Mexico, and that she did it while high on methamphetamine, with a boyfriend who encouraged her worst impulses in a crime that was planned and premeditated. The murder of Tammy King shocked the small community of Backcliff. Neighbors described Tammy as a quiet woman who kept to herself but was always friendly when you saw her. No one suspected that her relationship with her granddaughter had deteriorated to the point of violence. When Tammy's body was discovered, covered with a sheet, nude, shot in the head in her own bedroom, the community struggled to process what had happened. How could a grandmother be killed by her own granddaughter? How could two teenagers commit such a brutal crime and then calmly flee, cutting and dyeing their hair, trying to sell stolen guns, planning their escape to Mexico? Galveston County Sheriff Jimmy Fullen spoke about the case after Uriah's conviction, saying simply, "Justice has been served for Tammy King and her loved ones. But justice for Tammy's death won't bring her back. It won't erase the trauma of her final moments when she was shot by someone she'd raised, someone she'd tried to help. It won't restore the years she should have had ahead of her. Tammy King was 61 years old. She should have had more time." What makes the Tara King case particularly striking is how thoroughly the digital evidence documented the crime: Instagram messages, Cash App transactions, Walmart surveillance footage, social media posts asking for rides and help fleeing. 20 years ago, a case like this might have been difficult to prove. But in 2025, teenagers leave digital breadcrumbs everywhere. Every message, every transaction, every Google search creates evidence that investigators can follow. Tara and Uriah's Instagram messages revealed not just their plans to kill Tammy, but their emotional state, their drug use, their motivations. The messages showed premeditation. This wasn't a sudden decision, but something they'd been discussing, working up to, planning. The Cash App transfers showed financial motive. The social media contacts with acquaintances showed their attempts to flee and their admissions of guilt. The surveillance footage documented their efforts to change their appearance. In the end, the very technology Tara and Uriah used to communicate and coordinate became the evidence that convicted Uriah and will likely be used to convict Tara as well. As we wait for Tara King's trial, the questions linger. Could this have been prevented? Were there warning signs that were missed? Should someone have intervened earlier in Tara's relationship with Uriah? Tammy had tried to intervene. She'd disapproved of the relationship. She'd set boundaries, refusing to let Uriah stay overnight. She'd tried to keep Tara in school to give her structure and stability. But Tara didn't want what Tammy was offering. She wanted freedom, money, and a life without rules. And when Tammy stood in the way, Tara chose violence. The methamphetamine use clearly played a role. Both teenagers were under the influence when they discussed the murder. Tara herself admitted she was, quote, 9 when she killed Tammy. The drug lowered inhibitions, increased aggression, and clouded judgment. But meth doesn't create hatred where none exists. It doesn't make someone plan a murder, steal thousands of dollars, and flee toward Mexico. Those were choices Tara and Uriah made, choices they're now facing the consequences for. Tammy King deserved better. She deserved to grow old peacefully. She deserved gratitude from the granddaughter she'd raised, not a bullet in the head. She deserved to wake up on February 6, 2025, and have another day, another year, another decade of life. Instead, she became another victim in a long line of family members murdered by the teenagers they tried to help. The Tara King case serves as a stark reminder of how drugs, troubled relationships, and lack of intervention can combine into deadly violence. It shows us how easily teenagers can descend into criminality when they're surrounded by the wrong influences and fueled by substances that destroy their judgment. And it demonstrates, once again, that the people we're supposed to trust most, our family members, can sometimes be the most dangerous of all. Uriah Urick will spend the rest of his life in prison for his role in Tammy's death. Tara King, if convicted, will likely face the same fate. 2 young lives ended by their own choices, one older life stolen by violence and betrayal, and a small community in Backcliff, Texas, left to wonder how something so terrible could happen in their quiet town by the bay. Case 6. Marlene Olive. She seemed like the kind of daughter every parent dreamed of having, smart, social, with her whole life ahead of her. But in June 1975, 15-year-old Marlene Olive and her older boyfriend turned that dream into the stuff of nightmares, carrying out murders so brutal that even seasoned investigators struggled to comprehend them. Jim and Naomi Olive had built a comfortable life in Terra Linda, California, a quiet community in Marin County, north of San Francisco. Jim worked as an engineer at a power plant, providing well for his family. The couple had adopted Marlene as a young child, and for years their family life appeared ordinary. But as Marlene entered her teenage years, the relationship between parents and daughter grew strained. She began pulling away from her adoptive parents, spending more time outside the home, becoming someone they struggled to recognize. At some point in early 1975, Marlene met Chuck Riley. He was older, a waterbed salesman with his own apartment and a life far removed from the suburban teenage world Marlene inhabited. The relationship was inappropriate on its face. She was just 15 years old. Riley was an adult man who should have known better. Jim and Naomi Olive recognized the danger. They tried to intervene to separate Marlene from Riley, to protect her from what they viewed as an unhealthy situation. Their efforts to be good parents would cost them everything. On June 21, 1975, a plan that had been forming in whispered conversations came to deadly fruition. That afternoon, Marlene arranged to go shopping with her father Jim. It seemed like a normal father-daughter outing, but Marlene knew something her father didn't, that Chuck Riley was at that very moment entering their home, where Naomi Olive was alone. Riley carried a claw hammer as he approached Naomi. He attacked her with the hammer, striking her repeatedly. When the hammer wasn't enough, Riley grabbed a kitchen knife and stabbed her. The brutality spoke to rage, to violence that went beyond what would be necessary simply to kill someone. By the time Jim and Marlene returned home, Naomi was dead. Jim Olive walked into his house and into an ambush. Riley was still there, still armed. When Jim attempted to intervene, Riley shot him, killing him in his own home. Marlene had watched this unfold. Her boyfriend had just murdered both of her parents, and her role in orchestrating the murders would soon become clear. The murders were just the beginning. Riley and Marlene then faced the question every killer must answer: what to do with the bodies. Their solution was as disturbing as the murders themselves. In the backyard of the Olive home, the couple built a fire in the barbecue pit. They then attempted to cremate Jim and Naomi Olive's bodies, burning them in the same outdoor space where the family had likely shared meals during happier times. The backyard barbecue, a symbol of American suburban domesticity, became a funeral pyre. By destroying the bodies, Riley and Marlene hoped to eliminate evidence, to make the Olives simply disappear. The disappearance of Jim and Naomi Olive didn't go unnoticed for long. Jim's business partner grew concerned when Jim failed to show up for work and couldn't be reached. After a week passed with no sign of the couple, he contacted the police. When officers arrived at the Olive home in Terra Linda, they found it in disarray. More troubling than the mess was the absence of both Jim and Naomi, along with their teenage daughter, Marlene. Marlene appeared at the police station later that day. What followed was a bizarre series of shifting explanations. She first claimed her parents had gone to Lake Tahoe for a vacation and simply hadn't returned. As detectives continued questioning her into a second day, her story changed. Now she claimed that Jim had killed Naomi and then fled. Under continued pressure, she contradicted herself again, this time suggesting that her mother had been the killer. The inconsistencies were obvious. As investigators dug deeper, the truth began to emerge. Marlene hadn't been a victim or a witness. She had been a participant. Both Marlene Olive and Chuck Riley were arrested and charged with the murders of Jim and Naomi Olive. But the question that would dominate the case wasn't whether they had killed Jim and Naomi Olive. It was how the justice system should respond, particularly when it came to Marlene, who was only 15 years old. Riley, as an adult, faced the full weight of the criminal justice system. He was convicted and sentenced to death. However, in the years that followed, his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. Riley would spend the rest of his life behind bars, eventually dying in prison. Marlene's case was different. Because she was a teenager at the time of the murders, she was tried as a juvenile. The juvenile justice system in 1975 operated under a different philosophy than adult courts. One focused more on rehabilitation than pure punishment. Marlene was convicted for her role in the murders, but her sentence reflected her age and the system's belief that teenagers have the capacity to change. She served only 4 years before being released in 1979. 4 years for 2 murders. 4 years for helping orchestrate the deaths of the people who had adopted her, raised her, loved her. The difference in how the 2 defendants were treated was stark. Chuck Riley received a death sentence, later commuted to life, where he would die. Marlene Olive served 4 years and walked free. The justice system made a clear distinction based on age. Riley was viewed as the adult manipulator, the predator who had influenced a troubled teenager. Marlene was seen as young enough to be rehabilitated, deserving of a second chance despite the magnitude of her crime. After her release in 1979, Marlene Olive disappeared from public view. The juvenile justice system sealed her records, giving her the opportunity to start over with a new identity, a new life. Whether she used that opportunity wisely, whether she felt remorse, whether she was truly rehabilitated, these questions remain unanswered. The Olive case stands as one of the earliest high-profile examples of teenage parricide in modern American history. It occurred at a time when such crimes were rare enough to shock the nation. Nearly 5 decades later, the case raises questions that continue to resonate. Was 4 years adequate punishment for someone who helped murder both parents? Does age truly diminish responsibility when the crime is this severe? These aren't questions with easy answers. The juvenile justice system exists because we recognize that teenagers aren't fully developed adults, that they're more susceptible to influence and less capable of fully understanding consequences. But that recognition has to be balanced against the reality of what was done. 2 people murdered in their own home, their bodies burned in their backyard. The 1975 context matters. This was before DNA evidence, before sophisticated psychological profiling, before the modern understanding of juvenile brain development. It was an era when teenage parricide was shocking enough to make national news. The cultural moment shaped the response. The 1970s saw growing questions about rehabilitation versus punishment. Whether Marlene Olive deserved the second chance she received, whether Jim and Naomi Olive would have wanted mercy for their daughter, these questions remain open, impossible to answer with certainty. The detail that haunts many who learn about this case is the barbecue pit. The murders themselves were brutal, but there was something particularly disturbing about attempting to cremate the bodies in the family's backyard, in a space designed for gatherings and celebrations. It spoke to a cold practicality, a willingness to desecrate not just the bodies but the memory of family life itself. That image captured the complete destruction of family that Marlene Olive helped bring about. Jim and Naomi Olive made the choice to adopt Marlene, to bring her into their home and raise her as their own daughter. They provided for her, presumably loved her, tried to guide her even when that guidance was rejected. When they saw her relationship with Chuck Riley as dangerous, they tried to intervene, not out of cruelty but out of concern. Their reward was brutal death, followed by the attempted destruction of their remains, followed by a justice system that released their killer after just 4 years. Whatever tensions existed in the Olive household, whatever conflicts Marlene felt, the response was disproportionate beyond measure. Teenagers argue with parents. Teenagers resent rules and boundaries. These are normal parts of growing up. Murder is not a normal response. The case file is closed. Chuck Riley is dead. Marlene Olive has been free for more than 4 decades, but the questions remain. Did Marlene Olive ever express genuine remorse? Did she rebuild her life successfully? Did the 4 years she served change her? We don't know. Privacy laws and the passage of time have obscured the answers. Marlene Olive, if she's still alive, would now be in her mid-60s, living somewhere under a name that isn't Olive, carrying secrets that only she fully knows. The disparity in sentencing between Marlene and Chuck Riley continues to spark debate. Some argue it was appropriate. He was the adult, the manipulator, the one who should have known better. Others see it as a grave injustice. She helped plan and participated in the murders of her own parents and served less time than many people serve for nonviolent offenses. Both perspectives carry weight. Both reveal something about how we think about age, responsibility, and whether redemption is possible for those who commit unforgivable acts. What cannot be debated is that on June 21, 1975, Jim and Naomi Olive died violently in their own home, killed by their daughter's boyfriend, and with their daughter's cooperation. No amount of analysis changes that fundamental reality. Case 7, Tyler Witt. The 14-year-old girl drugged her mother's drink with sleeping medication, then let her 19-year-old boyfriend into the house to stab her mother to death while she stood outside the bedroom humming to block out the screams. Their plan was modeled after Romeo and Juliet, but with her mother as the obstacle to be eliminated. Joanne Witt was 47 years old in 2009, a single mother raising her teenage daughter Tyler in the affluent gated community of El Dorado Hills, California. An accomplished engineer with a master's degree in mechanical engineering, Joanne worked for El Dorado County and provided her daughter with everything money could buy: acting lessons, writing lessons, summer camps, a modeling portfolio, travel on private planes, every electronic device imaginable. By all outward appearances, Joanne was the kind of devoted mother every child should have. But beneath the surface of their comfortable suburban life, tensions simmered. The relationship between mother and daughter had been contentious for years, marked by conflict and occasional violence that dated back to Tyler's early childhood. When Tyler was just 5 years old, Child Protective Services removed her from Joanne's custody for 6 months after Joanne hit her. A preschool teacher had noticed suspicious bruises on the little girl's face and body and reported them to authorities. Joanne was ordered to take anger management classes and vowed never to let something like that happen again. There were no more beatings after that, but there were loud arguments. Tyler later claimed her mother had a secret drinking problem that fueled their conflicts. As Tyler entered high school, the mother-daughter relationship grew increasingly strained. In December 2008, during her first year of high school, 14-year-old Tyler began spending time at a local coffee shop. There she met Stephen Paul Culver, who went by the nickname, quote, Rar. He was 19 years old, 5 years older than Tyler. The two became close friends and, according to Tyler, began dating on February 23, 2009. Weeks later, they became sexually active. When Culver began looking for a place of his own, Tyler had an idea. She convinced her mother to let Culver rent the extra bedroom in their house for $500 a month. She and Culver told Joanne that he was gay, and their relationship was more like that of a brother and sister. Joanne, despite concerns about renting to a young man 5 years older than her daughter, eventually agreed. She thought the arrangement would help pay the mortgage, and she believed Culver could help Tyler with her homework. No one in Joanne's family or circle of friends thought this was a good idea. Everyone warned her against letting this older teenager move into her home with her 14-year-old daughter. But Joanne was strong-willed and believed she could trust her daughter and Culver. She was tragically wrong. While living in the Witt home, Culver and Tyler began using marijuana, MDMA, and cocaine together. Their relationship was far from the innocent friendship they had portrayed. 1 month after Culver moved in, Joanne returned home and entered Culver's room to find her daughter crouched inside the closet, naked, covering herself with a pillow. Joanne realized immediately that she had interrupted the two having sex. Her 14-year-old daughter was in a sexual relationship with the 19-year-old man she had allowed into their home. She ordered Culver out of her house immediately. She called her friend Vinnie Catapano to assist in ejecting Culver. Catapano moved Culver's belongings to the sidewalk and warned him against further contact with the Witt family, threatening an East Coast-style reprisal should he disobey. But the discovery didn't end there. Joanne found Tyler's diary, which described their sexual relationship in explicit detail. She took the diary to the local police station and threatened to press statutory rape charges against Culver. Worried that Culver would go to prison and they would be torn apart forever, Tyler and Stephen devised a drastic plan. They would kill Joanne, then themselves. They discussed a Romeo and Juliet scenario, the star-crossed lovers, whose love was so pure that death was preferable to being apart. But Tyler realized a flaw in the plan. If she went missing, her mother would call the police immediately. The only way to follow through with their suicide pact was to eliminate Joanne first. On the night of June 11, 2009, Tyler poured her mother a drink and added a large amount of sleeping medication. She wanted to make sure her mother would be deeply asleep when the time came. Once Joanne fell asleep, Tyler let Culver into the home. They waited, smoking cigarettes, Tyler feeling really edgy, as she later testified. A few hours later, according to Tyler's testimony, she stood outside her mother's bedroom while Culver entered the room with a knife. "I put my hands on my ears, closed my eyes, and hummed," Tyler told the court. She said she didn't want to hear her mother's screams. Inside that bedroom, Joanne Witt was stabbed at least 20 times. Her throat was slit. She begged Culver to stop. When he finally emerged from the bedroom, according to Tyler, he looked in shock, covered in blood with a single tear under his eye. "I hugged him and told him everything was going to be okay," she testified. After killing Joanne, Tyler and Culver didn't kill themselves as planned. Instead, they visited the home of their friend, Matthew Widman. Culver showed Widman a white shopping bag containing a butcher knife covered with blood. Culver claimed he had used the knife to stab Joanne Witt in the throat and stomach. Tyler and Culver then left for San Francisco. They were on the run for 6 days. During that time, according to prosecutors, they showed no remorse. They were hanging out with friends, kissing and holding hands along the street, living their life without Joanne. Their hotel room in San Francisco held a bizarre mixture of Fruit Loops, cake, and rat poison, which the couple had apparently eaten in an attempt to fulfill their mutual suicide pact. Police also found condoms, marijuana, a suicide note, and a DVD of the film, quote, 6. On Friday, June 12, 2009, Joanne's supervisor noted her absence from work and tried repeatedly to contact her. This was highly unusual. Joanne always called when she wasn't coming to work. When she failed to show again the following Monday, June 15th, her supervisor called the El Dorado County Sheriff's Department and subsequently called her parents, Norb and Judy Witt. Sheriff's deputies met Joanne's parents at her home in El Dorado Hills. Inside, they discovered Joanne's body in her bed, covered by a blanket and lying on blood-soaked sheets. She had been stabbed at least 20 times. Tyler was nowhere to be found. At first, investigators feared the 14-year-old had been kidnapped, but as the investigation progressed, suspicion quickly focused on Tyler and Culver. Joanne had recently complained to authorities about Culver's sexual relationship with her underage daughter. On June 16, 2009, 6 days after the murder, Tyler and Culver were discovered at the shops at Tanforan in San Bruno, California. Police found them changing their clothes behind a dumpster. They were taken into custody. During Tyler's interrogation, she claimed to have no knowledge of her mother's death. When police reminded her that she was under arrest for murder, Tyler insisted her mother was not dead. "It's not true. She's not dead. She can't be dead," she shouted. She then invoked her right to legal counsel and ended the interrogation. Culver asked about Tyler during his questioning, claiming to be worried about her. He initially denied having sex with Tyler when asked by detectives, but the evidence against both of them was overwhelming. DNA found under Joanne's fingernails belonged to Culver. He had also showed the murder weapon to friends and told 2 close friends that he had murdered Joanne. Tyler Witt accepted a plea deal before the case went to trial. In exchange for testifying against Stephen Culver, her charge was reduced from first-degree murder to second-degree murder. She pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. At Culver's trial in June 2011, Tyler took the stand to testify against her former boyfriend. She told the court about their plan to commit the murder together, about drugging her mother's drink, about standing outside the bedroom while Culver stabbed her mother to death. She claimed she went into quote 8 when her mother found the diary. Defense attorney Dane Weiner attacked Tyler's psychological state during cross-examination, suggesting her hatred may have sparked the crime. "The truth is, it was you who killed your mother," Weiner said. Tyler admitted to having 3 personalities: Tyler, the 14-year-old girl; Alex, her inner angel; and Toby, a demon from hell. Weiner also pressed the teen about her lack of emotion. "I think I've only been able to cry about it, like full-blown bawling, like 3 or 4 times," she said. The jury convicted Stephen Culver of first-degree murder and sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars for stabbing Joanne Witt to death. Norb and Judy Witt, Joanne's parents, were devastated. They had just returned from 2 months of traveling the country in their luxury RV when they received the phone call that would change their lives forever. Their daughter was dead, and their granddaughter was responsible. Norb Witt believed that Stephen Culver had, quote, 13 over Tyler. Quote 14, Norb explained. Quote 15. At Culver's sentencing, Joanne's brother Michael Witt said he hoped prison would bestow the worst possible experience for Culver. Joanne's father also made a statement, speaking to Tyler as well, calling her a murderer who made terrible decisions that she would have to pay for. Despite everything, Norb and Judy maintained some contact with their granddaughter. Norb sent letters to Tyler in prison, though he admitted in interviews that if she hadn't done whatever she did, her mother would still be alive. Tyler Witt was granted parole on August 26, 2022, after serving more than 13 years. She was released in 2023, having been deemed rehabilitated by the parole board. She had been 14 years old when she helped plan and facilitate her mother's murder. She was now in her late 20s, free to start over. The release was controversial. Some believed that after more than a decade in prison, Tyler deserved a chance to rebuild her life. Others felt she had not served enough time for her role in such a brutal murder, that her testimony against Culver had allowed her to escape the full consequences of what she had done. The case of Tyler Witt raises difficult questions about manipulation, culpability, and the capacity of teenage girls for violence. Was Tyler truly manipulated by an older boyfriend who exercised godlike control over her? Or was she, as some suggested, a manipulative girl who had been controlling her mother since childhood and simply found a partner willing to carry out her darkest wishes? Tyler's claim that she stood outside the bedroom humming while Culver murdered her mother painted her as a passive participant, someone who couldn't bear to witness the violence. But she had drugged her mother's drink. She had let Culver into the house. She had told him it was okay to kill her younger brothers if they had been home that night, saying, quote 16, when he warned her he might have to kill witnesses. After the murder, she showed no remorse, partying with friends and enjoying her freedom while her mother's body lay undiscovered. Only when caught did she express regret, and even then, she admitted she could only cry about it 3 or 4 times. Tyler and Culver compared themselves to Romeo and Juliet in their journals, framing their relationship as a tragic love story thwarted by a cruel parent. But Shakespeare's lovers died together rather than harm anyone else. They chose death over separation. Tyler and Culver chose murder. When faced with the prospect of being apart, they didn't commit suicide as planned. Instead, they killed the woman who stood between them and tried to eat rat poison only after they were on the run, as if fulfilling the suicide pact was an afterthought. The comparison to Romeo and Juliet was self-serving and false. There was nothing romantic or noble about what they did. They brutally murdered a woman who was trying to protect her 14-year-old daughter from an inappropriate relationship with an adult man. Joanne Witt worked hard to provide for her daughter. She earned a master's degree, built a career as an engineer, and gave Tyler opportunities many children never receive. When she discovered her daughter was in a sexual relationship with a 19-year-old, she did what any responsible parent would do. She tried to intervene. She kicked Culver out of her home. She went to the police. Her reward was to be drugged, to fall asleep in her own bed, and to be stabbed to death while her daughter stood outside the door, blocking out the sound of her screams. Whatever tensions existed between Joanne and Tyler, whatever mistakes Joanne may have made as a mother, no one deserves to die like that. And the fact that her own daughter facilitated her murder makes the tragedy that much more profound. Tyler Witt is free now, living somewhere with a chance to start over. Joanne Witt remains dead, buried without ever knowing that her daughter's manipulation and obsession with an older boyfriend would cost her everything. Case 8. Chelsea Richardson. The 20-year-old girlfriend masterminded a brutal plot to murder her boyfriend's parents for their $1.65 million estate, recruiting her roommate to shoot and stab the couple while they slept, then bragged about it to cellmates while awaiting trial. Rick and Susanna Wamsley lived in Mansfield, Texas, a comfortable suburb in the Dallas-Fort Worth metroplex. They were an upper-middle-class couple who had built a successful life together. Rick was 46, Susanna was 46, and they had raised 2 children, a daughter named Sarah and a son named Andrew. The Wamsleys had accumulated significant wealth, an estate worth approximately $1.65 million. They lived in a nice home, provided well for their children, and seemed to embody the American dream. But by 2003, they had growing concerns about their son Andrew and the young woman he was dating. Andrew Wamsley was born on July 30, 1984. In January 2003, when he was 18 years old, he began dating 20-year-old Chelsea Richardson from Fort Worth. The relationship moved quickly, with Chelsea becoming a significant presence in Andrew's life. Andrew's parents reportedly disapproved of their son's relationship with Chelsea. The exact reasons for their disapproval aren't entirely clear from the records, But Rick and Susanna Walmsley had concerns about Chelsea's influence on their son and the direction his life was taking. Chelsea Richardson, for her part, came from a working-class family. Her mother, Celia, was a 19-year employee of the U.S. government. Her brother, James, was described as a hard worker. They were, according to Chelsea's defense attorney, quote, zero. But Chelsea herself would prove to be exactly the kind of person who gets in trouble, the worst kind. Sometime in October 2003, Chelsea Richardson and Andrew Walmsley began conspiring to kill Andrew's parents. According to prosecutors, Chelsea was the mastermind, the one who conceived the plan and recruited others to help carry it out. The motive was simple: greed. If Rick and Susanna Walmsley were dead, Andrew would inherit their $1.65 million estate. He and Chelsea could share in that wealth, living the life they wanted without his parents' interference or disapproval. Chelsea was roommates with a young woman named Susana Alejandra Toledano, who was 19 years old. According to Toledano's later testimony, Chelsea and Andrew pressured her into participating in the murder plot. They also involved Hilario Cardenas, a manager at an IHOP restaurant in Arlington, who would provide the gun used in the murders. The conspirators made at least 2 attempts to kill Rick and Susanna before finally succeeding. On November 9, 2003, Toledano was made to shoot at the gas tank of the Walmsley's Jeep Laredo in a failed murder attempt. When that didn't work, they regrouped and planned a more direct approach. On the evening of December 11, 2003, the plan was finally carried out. Susana Toledano entered the Walmsley home in Mansfield while the couple slept. What happened next was savage and sustained. Rick Walmsley was shot in the head and then stabbed 21 times. Susanna Walmsley was shot and then stabbed 18 times. The brutality was extreme, far beyond what would be necessary simply to kill someone. It spoke to rage, to a frenzy of violence that went on and on. According to the prosecution, Chelsea Richardson had orchestrated everything. She wanted Rick and Susanna Walmsley dead so she and Andrew could collect the estate. Toledano, under pressure from Chelsea and Andrew, had carried out the actual killings, but Chelsea was the driving force behind it all. The conspirators also wanted to kill Andrew's older sister, Sarah, but she was not home on the night of the murders. She was spared only by chance. The bodies of Rick and Susanna Walmsley were discovered in their Mansfield home. The brutality of the crime scene shocked investigators. Both victims had been shot and stabbed multiple times. It was clear this was not a robbery gone wrong or a crime of passion. This was a planned execution. As detectives investigated, they learned about Andrew Walmsley's relationship with Chelsea Richardson. They discovered that Andrew stood to inherit a significant estate from his parents' deaths. Suspicion quickly focused on Andrew, Chelsea, and their associates. Investigators worked the case methodically. They interviewed friends and family members. They examined financial records and phone records. They built a timeline of events leading up to the murders. A crucial piece of evidence emerged when Rick Walmsley's body was examined. Hair was found clutched in his fist, evidence that he had fought back against his attackers. DNA testing connected that hair to Susana Toledano. It was, according to Detective Ralph Standifer, the break that cracked the case. Had he not had that hair in his hand, I don't think we would have ever got there, Standifer told the Dallas Observer in 2004. The investigation eventually led to 4 arrests: Andrew Walmsley, Chelsea Richardson, Susana Toledano, and Hilario Cardenas. All were charged with capital murder. Susana Toledano accepted a plea deal in January 2005. To avoid the death penalty, she agreed to turn state's evidence and testify against Chelsea Richardson and Andrew Walmsley. She pleaded guilty to murder and was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Her testimony would prove crucial in the trials that followed. Chelsea Richardson's trial began in May 2005. the prosecution presented a damning case. Toledano testified that Chelsea had told her to kill the Walmsleys so they could share in the family's estate. Quote 2. Prosecutor Mike Parrish asked Toledano during testimony. She simply replied, quote 3. But it wasn't just Toledano's testimony that sealed Chelsea's fate. Two former cellmates of Richardson at the Tarrant County Jail, Vanessa Heydrich and Catherine Norton, both imprisoned on drug charges, testified that Chelsea couldn't stop talking about the crime while she was in jail awaiting trial. According to their testimony, Chelsea had bragged about the murders, showing no remorse for what had been done. She spoke about the crime as if it were something to be proud of, as if she had pulled off something clever. The defense tried to counter the prosecution's case. They presented a letter allegedly written by Susana Toledano to Chelsea's mother, in which Toledano supposedly took full responsibility for the murders and said Chelsea was not involved. A handwriting expert for the defense said the letter was written by Toledano, but when Toledano took the stand, she testified she had never written that letter. The defense also tried to suggest that Chelsea's family could vouch for her whereabouts on the night of the murders, but the evidence against her was overwhelming. After 3 hours of deliberation, the jury convicted Chelsea Richardson of capital murder. The jury then deliberated for just over 2 hours before unanimously sentencing her to death by lethal injection. At 21 years old, Chelsea Richardson became the first woman ever sentenced to death in Tarrant County, Texas. The jury cited the crime's brutal and premeditated nature and the fact that Chelsea was considered a, quote, 5. Andrew Walmsley was convicted of capital murder on March 5, 2006. However, jurors did not view Andrew as a future danger to society in the same way they viewed Chelsea. He was sentenced to life in prison rather than death. Chelsea Richardson's case didn't end with her death sentence. In 2007, her appellate attorney Bob Ford filed a post-conviction writ of habeas corpus alleging that Richardson had been illegally convicted. Ford raised 9 points of error, including a crucial allegation that prosecutor Mike Parrish had failed to provide a psychologist's notes to the defense team, notes that could have suggested Toledano, not Richardson, was the mastermind behind the murders. The withholding of this evidence became the central focus of Richardson's appeals. Both Richardson's attorneys and the current Tarrant County District Attorney's Office agreed that Parrish had withheld material that should have been turned over to the defense. Parrish denied withholding evidence intentionally, stating he learned about the psychologist's notes after the trial and would have turned them over to the defense if he had them at the time. He also said he had no problem with Richardson's sentence being changed to life in prison, Parrish said. On December 13, 2011, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals sent the case back to Tarrant County prosecutors, who agreed that Richardson should be resentenced. Her death sentence was commuted to life in prison. She remains in prison today, no longer facing execution, but serving a life term for her role in masterminding the brutal murders of Rick and Susana Walmsley. Rick and Susana Walmsley were 46 years old when they were murdered in their own home. They had worked hard, built a successful life, raised 2 children. They had accumulated wealth through their own efforts, and they had every right to enjoy the fruits of their labor. Their concern about their son's girlfriend was natural and appropriate. Parents are supposed to be protective, to question relationships that seem unhealthy or concerning. Rick and Susana's disapproval of Chelsea Richardson wasn't cruel or controlling. It was an attempt to guide their son toward better choices. Their reward was to be shot and stabbed to death in their own bed while they slept. Rick fought back. The hair clutched in his fist proved that, but he and his wife were overwhelmed by the violence inflicted upon them. Their daughter Sarah was spared only because she wasn't home that night. She lost both parents in a single night of horror, and she had to live with the knowledge that her own brother had been involved in their murders. One of the central questions in the case was who truly masterminded the plot. Was it Chelsea Richardson, as prosecutors argued, Or was it Susana Toledano, as the psychologist's notes suggested? The evidence pointed strongly toward Chelsea. Multiple witnesses, including Toledano herself, testified that Chelsea was the driving force. Chelsea's jailhouse, bragging to cellmates, suggested someone who felt ownership of the crime, someone who saw herself as the architect of what had happened. Toledano, by contrast, appeared to be someone who was pressured and manipulated into participating. She accepted the plea deal and cooperated fully with prosecutors, expressing remorse for what she had done. But the withheld evidence created enough doubt that Chelsea's death sentence was commuted. Whether she was the primary instigator or a co-conspirator who was more culpable than the others, she was undeniably guilty of participating in a plot to murder two people for money. What makes the Walmsley murders particularly chilling is the purity of the motive: greed. This wasn't a case of abuse driving someone to desperate violence. It wasn't passion or jealousy or mental illness. It was simple, cold calculation. Chelsea Richardson and Andrew Walmsley wanted money. They wanted to live a certain lifestyle. And they were willing to murder two people, people who had done nothing except disapprove of their relationship, to get what they wanted. As prosecutor Mike Parrish said, they tried to kill them at least twice before, and the motive was strictly greed and money. Those two things are what the jury indicated to us really pushed them that way. The fact that they made multiple attempts before finally succeeding speaks to determination and planning. This wasn't an impulsive crime. It was premeditated murder for financial gain, with no regard for the humanity of the victims. Chelsea Richardson remains in prison, serving a life sentence. Andrew Walmsley is also serving life. Susana Toledano is eligible for parole after 30 years. Hilario Cardenas, who provided the gun, also received a prison sentence. The Walmsley family was left shattered. Sarah lost both parents and, in a sense, her brother as well. The extended family mourned not just Rick and Susana, but the loss of family unity, the betrayal by one of their own. The Mansfield community was shocked by the brutality of the crime. This wasn't supposed to happen in their quiet suburb. Upper-middle-class families weren't supposed to be slaughtered in their beds by their own children and the people those children chose to associate with. But it did happen. And it serves as a reminder that evil doesn't always come from strangers, doesn't always have complex psychological motivations. Sometimes evil is as simple as wanting money and being willing to kill to get it. Chelsea Richardson may have avoided the death penalty, but she will spend the rest of her life in prison for masterminding murders so brutal, so calculated, that even the prosecutor who had initially sought her execution acknowledged that what she did was monstrous beyond measure. Case 9. Jasmine Richardson. On the morning of April 23, 2006, a friend of the Richardson family stopped by their home in Medicine Hat, a small city in southeastern Alberta, Canada. Mark and Deborah Richardson hadn't shown up for work, which was unusual. They weren't answering their phones. Something felt wrong. When the friend looked through a window, what she saw made her immediately call 911. Inside the house, she could see what appeared to be bodies, blood, signs of a violent struggle. When police arrived and entered the Richardson home, they discovered a scene of absolute carnage. Mark Richardson, 42, lay dead in the basement, stabbed 24 times. His wife Deborah, 48, had been stabbed in the bedroom. And in one of the upstairs rooms, they found 8-year-old Jacob Richardson, the couple's youngest child, stabbed in the chest and left to bleed to death in his bed. An entire family had been slaughtered in their own home. 3 victims, all stabbed multiple times, all murdered while they should have been safe. But there was one family member missing, 12-year-old Jasmine Richardson, the couple's daughter and Jacob's older sister. Police immediately feared the worst, that Jasmine had been kidnapped or killed and her body taken from the scene. But as investigators began piecing together the evidence, a horrifying truth emerged. Jasmine wasn't a victim. she was a perpetrator. She and her 23-year-old boyfriend Jeremy Steinke had planned and executed the murders together, killing Jasmine's entire family because her parents disapproved of their relationship. Jasmine Richardson was 12 years old when she helped murder her family. She would become the youngest person ever convicted of multiple murders in Canadian history. And her case would spark a national debate about juvenile justice, rehabilitation, and whether a child that young can truly understand the finality of murder. This is the story of a sixth grader who conspired with an adult predator to annihilate her family, and what happened when the Canadian justice system had to decide what to do with a 12-year-old triple murderer. Mark and Deborah Richardson were hardworking parents raising 2 children in Medicine Hat, a quiet prairie city of about 60,000 people. Mark worked in the oil and gas industry. Deborah had a job in customer service. They were ordinary people living an ordinary life, focused on providing for their kids and keeping their family safe. Their son Jacob was 8 years old, a typical elementary school kid who loved video games, playing with friends, and spending time with his family. He looked up to his older sister Jasmine, following her around the house, wanting to be included in whatever she was doing. Jasmine had been a normal preteen until recently. She'd had friends, done well in school, participated in regular childhood activities. But when she entered 6th grade and started junior high, something changed. She discovered the Gothic subculture. She began dressing differently, wearing dark clothes and heavy makeup. She started spending time on alternative social networking sites where teenagers and young adults shared interests in dark music, vampire culture, and macabre aesthetics. Her parents weren't thrilled about the change, but they chalked it up to normal adolescent experimentation. Lots of kids go through phases. Lots of preteens try on different identities as they figure out who they are. But Jasmine's involvement in the goth community led to something far more dangerous, a relationship with a 23-year-old man named Jeremy Steinke. Jeremy Steinke was 23 years old, unemployed, and living a fantasy life online. He called himself Soul Eater or Runefangs 300 on various platforms. He was obsessed with the Gothic subculture, claiming to be a 300-year-old werewolf and vampire. He watched horror movies obsessively, particularly Natural Born Killers, the controversial 1994 film about a young couple on a murder spree. Jeremy had no business interacting with a 12-year-old girl. The age gap alone, nearly double her age, should have been an immediate red flag. But online platforms in 2006 weren't as regulated as they are today, and it was relatively easy for adults and children to interact without supervision. Jasmine and Jeremy met through mutual friends in the local goth scene. Despite the 11-year age difference, they began a relationship. Jeremy called Jasmine his quote too. They exchanged messages filled with Gothic romanticism, dark fantasies, and increasingly violent content. When Mark and Deborah found out their 12-year-old daughter was involved with a 23-year-old man, they were horrified. They forbid Jasmine from seeing Jeremy. They tried to monitor her online activity. They did everything parents in their situation would do to protect their daughter from what they correctly recognized as a predatory relationship. But their intervention came too late. The relationship had already progressed beyond their control. And Jeremy Steinke, the adult in the situation, wasn't about to let a 12-year-old girl's parents get in his way. In the days and weeks before the murders, Jasmine and Jeremy exchanged hundreds of messages on various online platforms. These messages would later be recovered by police and used as evidence in their trials. The content was disturbing. Jeremy and Jasmine didn't just talk about how much they loved each other or how unfair her parents were being. They talked explicitly about killing her family. Jeremy sent messages saying he would kill anyone who tried to keep them apart. Jasmine responded enthusiastically, encouraging the violence, discussing how they would do it. They referenced Natural Born Killers, fantasizing about being like the movie's protagonists, young lovers who kill together and flee into a romantic, violent future. In one particularly chilling exchange, Jasmine asked Jeremy if he would kill her family for her. He said yes. She said she wanted them dead so they could be together. These weren't vague threats or abstract fantasies. These were concrete plans, discussed in detail, with both parties clearly understanding what they were talking about. On April 22, 2006, the night before the murders, the planning intensified. Jasmine and Jeremy finalized their plan. They decided Jeremy would go to the Richardson home and kill Mark and Deborah while Jasmine helped. Then they would run away together, leaving Medicine Hat behind and starting a new life. They even discussed what they would wear, what weapons they would use, and how they would dispose of evidence. This wasn't a spontaneous crime of passion. This was premeditated murder, planned by a 23-year-old man and a 12-year-old girl. On the evening of April 23rd, Jeremy Steinke went to the Richardson family home, armed with a knife. Jasmine let him in. The plan they'd discussed online for weeks was now becoming reality. Jeremy went to the basement first, where Mark Richardson was. What happened next was brutal and sustained. Jeremy stabbed Mark 24 times, attacking him with such ferocity that the knife punctured his heart, lungs, liver, and other vital organs. Mark fought back. There was evidence of a struggle, but he was overpowered and killed. The violence in the basement was loud enough that Deborah, upstairs in the bedroom, knew something terrible was happening. But before she could escape or call for help, Jeremy came for her. He stabbed Deborah multiple times, leaving her to die in her bedroom. And then there was Jacob, 8-year-old Jacob Richardson, who should have been the one person in the house that even these killers would spare. He was a child. He was Jasmine's little brother. He'd done nothing wrong except be born into a family that his sister wanted to escape. According to evidence presented at trial, Jasmine went to Jacob's room. Her little brother, who loved her, who looked up to her, who trusted her completely. And she stabbed him in the chest. Jeremy later claimed he'd told Jasmine not to kill Jacob, that killing the parents would have been enough. But Jasmine insisted. She said she wanted to kill her brother herself. She wanted to be a natural-born killer, like the characters in the movie they'd watched together. Jacob Richardson bled to death in his bed, killed by his own sister. He was 8 years old. After murdering all 3 family members, Jasmine and Jeremy fled together. They took items from the house, valuables perhaps, or things they thought they'd need for their new life on the run. They left the bodies behind, the house soaked in blood, and disappeared into the night. For the next several hours, Jasmine and Jeremy were fugitives. They went to a party attended by friends from the goth community. They acted as if nothing had happened, drinking, socializing, celebrating their freedom. At some point during the party, Jasmine was seen wearing a blood-stained hoodie. When asked about it, she made some vague comment and moved on. No one at the party suspected that just hours earlier, she'd participated in the murder of her entire family. But by the morning of April 24th, police had discovered the bodies. They'd identified Jasmine as missing and issued an immediate alert. They'd also begun investigating Jeremy Steinke, whose name had come up in interviews with Jasmine's friends. The manhunt was brief. Within 24 hours of the murders, police located Jasmine and Jeremy in Leader, Saskatchewan, a small town about 130 kilometers from Medicine Hat. They were arrested without incident and taken into custody. When questioned separately, both initially tried to minimize their involvement or shift blame, but the evidence against them was overwhelming. The online messages, the forensic evidence from the scene, witness testimony about their relationship and their plans. Eventually, both confessed to their roles in the murders. Jeremy Steinke was tried as an adult and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. The evidence against him was damning. He'd stabbed Mark Richardson 24 times. He'd killed Deborah. And even if Jasmine had struck the blow that killed Jacob, Jeremy was guilty of murder under Canadian law because he'd participated in the overall crime. The trial revealed disturbing details about Jeremy's psychology. He'd been obsessed with violence, with vampire culture, with the idea of being something more than human. He'd encouraged a 12-year-old girl to participate in murder, manipulated her through their relationship, and ultimately helped carry out the slaughter of her family. Prosecutors presented the online messages showing premeditation. They presented forensic evidence linking Jeremy to the crime scene. They called witnesses who testified about his obsession with natural-born killers and his claims to be a centuries-old vampire. The defense tried to argue that Jeremy was mentally ill, that his delusions about being a vampire indicated psychosis. But psychiatric evaluations suggested that while Jeremy had issues, he understood right from wrong and had been capable of forming intent to commit murder. In December 2008, Jeremy Steinke was convicted on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. He won't be eligible for release until at least 2033, when he'll be in his 50s. Jasmine's case was far more complicated. Under Canadian law, she couldn't be tried as an adult because she was only 12 at the time of the murders. She had to be tried in youth court, under the Youth Criminal Justice Act. The trial had to balance 2 competing realities. On one hand, Jasmine had participated in the murder of 3 people, including her own 8-year-old brother. On the other hand, she was 12 years old, barely out of elementary school, and had been in a relationship with an adult man who'd groomed and manipulated her. Prosecutors charged Jasmine with 3 counts of first-degree murder. They presented evidence that she'd actively participated in planning the murders. They showed the online messages where she'd encouraged Jeremy and expressed her desire for her family to be dead. They presented testimony that she'd personally stabbed Jacob. The defense argued that Jasmine had been manipulated by Jeremy, that as a 12-year-old she couldn't fully understand the consequences of her actions, that she deserved a chance at rehabilitation rather than pure punishment. Psychiatric experts testified about adolescent brain development, explaining that 12-year-olds lack the same capacity for judgment and impulse control as adults. They discussed how easily children can be influenced by older partners, especially in romantic relationships where there's a power imbalance. In July 2007, Jasmine Richardson was convicted on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. She was Canada's youngest person ever convicted of multiple murders. But because of her age and Canada's juvenile justice system, her sentence was dramatically different from Jeremy's. The maximum sentence available under the Youth Criminal Justice Act was 10 years, 4 years in custody, followed by 4.5 years of conditional supervision in the community, plus additional psychological treatment. Jasmine Richardson, who'd helped murder her parents and personally stabbed her 8-year-old brother, would be free by her mid-20s. The difference between Jeremy's and Jasmine's sentences highlights the fundamental difference between the Canadian and American approaches to juvenile justice. In the United States, juveniles can often be tried as adults for serious crimes and sentenced to life in prison or even death, though the Supreme Court has since prohibited executing juveniles. American courts focus heavily on punishment and public safety. Canada's Youth Criminal Justice Act takes a different approach. It's built on the principle that young offenders, even those who commit serious crimes, are fundamentally different from adults and should be treated with an emphasis on rehabilitation rather than pure punishment. The maximum sentence for any crime committed by someone under 14 is 10 years, no matter how horrific the offense. The philosophy is that children's brains are still developing, that they're more susceptible to peer pressure and manipulation, and that they have a greater capacity for change than adults. Jasmine's case tested that philosophy to its limits. Could a 12-year-old who'd murdered her entire family, including stabbing her own brother, really be rehabilitated in 10 years? Could someone that young ever truly understand the finality and horror of what she'd done? The Canadian justice system said yes. Jasmine would be given a chance at redemption. During her years in custody, Jasmine participated in intensive psychological treatment. She worked with therapists to understand what she'd done, to process the trauma of her relationship with Jeremy, and to develop the emotional and cognitive tools she'd need to reintegrate into society. According to reports from those involved in her treatment, Jasmine expressed remorse for the murders. She acknowledged that she'd been manipulated by Jeremy, but also accepted responsibility for her own actions. She participated fully in her treatment programs and made progress in understanding the magnitude of what she'd done. Mental health professionals who worked with Jasmine reported that she showed genuine change. They believed she'd been groomed by an adult predator, that her involvement in the murders was influenced by that manipulation, and that with proper treatment, she could be rehabilitated. But not everyone agreed. Members of the extended Richardson family were devastated by the idea that Jasmine might be released after just 10 years. They'd lost Mark, Deborah, and Jacob, an entire family wiped out, and the person who'd helped kill them would walk free while still in her 20s. The tension between justice for victims and rehabilitation for offenders is never easy to navigate. In Jasmine's case, it became a national debate. In May 2016, after serving her full 10-year sentence, Jasmine Richardson was released from custody. She'd completed all her treatment programs. She'd satisfied the requirements of her sentence. Under Canadian law, she'd paid her debt to society. As part of her release, Jasmine was given a new identity. Canadian publication bans protect the identities of young offenders even after they're released. The media is prohibited from publishing photos of Jasmine or revealing her new name or location. The purpose of this protection is to give young offenders a genuine chance at rebuilding their lives without being forever defined by crimes they committed as children. But it's also deeply controversial, especially in cases like Jasmine's, where the crimes were so horrific. Somewhere in Canada right now, Jasmine Richardson is living under a new name. She could be your neighbor, your co-worker, someone you pass on the street. She's in her early 30s, young enough to have a full life ahead of her. She could have a career, a relationship, maybe even children of her own someday. And no one around her would know that when she was 12 years old, she helped murder her entire family. Members of the extended Richardson family have spoken publicly about their grief and their feelings about Jasmine's release. They're careful not to violate the publication ban, but they've been clear about their pain. They lost Mark, a brother, an uncle, a friend. They lost Deborah, a sister-in-law, an aunt, a beloved family member. And most heartbreakingly, they lost Jacob, an 8-year-old boy who should be in his mid-20s now, building his own life. The family doesn't believe that 10 years was enough. They don't believe that someone who participated in murdering 3 people, including a child, should be walking free with a new identity and a chance to start over. They point out that Mark, Deborah, and Jacob don't get second chances. They don't get new identities. They're simply dead forever because a 12-year-old girl and her 23-year-old boyfriend decided to kill them. But Canadian law is clear. Jasmine served her sentence. She completed her treatment. She's entitled to her freedom and to the protection of her new identity. The family's pain is real and valid, but so is the legal principle that children, even those who commit terrible crimes, deserve a chance at rehabilitation. One crucial aspect of this case that can't be overlooked is Jeremy Steinke's role as a predator. He was 23 years old pursuing a relationship with a 12-year-old girl. That alone is criminal, regardless of anything that happened afterward. Jeremy groomed Jasmine. He exposed her to violent content. He encouraged her darkest impulses. He created a fantasy world where murdering her family was a romantic, rebellious act rather than the horrific crime it actually was. Would Jasmine have killed her family without Jeremy's influence? We'll never know. What we do know is that she was a child in a relationship with an adult who had power over her, who manipulated her, and who led her down a path toward violence. This doesn't absolve Jasmine of responsibility. She made choices. She participated actively in the murders, and she had to face consequences. But it does contextualize her actions in a way that's important for understanding the case. Jeremy Steinke preyed on a vulnerable 12-year-old girl. He sexualized her, isolated her from her family, and ultimately encouraged her to participate in murdering her own parents and brother. His culpability is enormous, and he, unlike Jasmine, will spend most or all of the rest of his life in prison. In all the discussion of juvenile justice, rehabilitation, and predatory relationships, it's crucial not to lose sight of Jacob Richardson. He was 8 years old. He was in elementary school. He loved video games and playing with friends. He looked up to his big sister. He trusted her completely, and she killed him. She went into his room and stabbed him in the chest while he was in his bed. Jacob Richardson didn't get to grow up. He didn't get to go to high school or learn to drive or fall in love or figure out what he wanted to do with his life. He died at 8 years old, murdered by someone he loved and trusted. The person who killed him is now free, living under a new identity, given a second chance at life. Jacob doesn't get a second chance. His parents don't get a second chance. They're just gone. This is the unbearable injustice at the heart of the case. No matter how compelling the arguments for rehabilitation, no matter how much Jasmine has changed, the fact remains that Jacob Richardson is dead because of her actions. He deserves to be remembered as more than a statistic, more than the youngest victim in a notorious case. He was a child with his whole life ahead of him, and that life was stolen by his own sister. Jeremy Steinke remains incarcerated in a Canadian federal prison. He won't be eligible for parole until 2033 at the earliest. He's now in his 40s, having spent most of his adult life in prison for murders he committed when he was 23. There's no indication that Jeremy has expressed genuine remorse or undergone the kind of rehabilitation that might make him eligible for early release. He remains a dangerous offender who groomed a child, manipulated her into participating in murder, and killed 3 people. Jasmine Richardson is living somewhere in Canada under a new identity. By all accounts, she's living a normal life, working, integrating into her community, trying to move forward from the horrific crimes she committed as a 12-year-old. She's protected by Canadian law. No one is allowed to publish her current name, her photo, or information about where she lives. The publication ban ensures that she can build a new life without being forever defined by what she did at age 12. Whether this is justice or a miscarriage of justice depends on your perspective. For those who believe in rehabilitation and second chances, particularly for child offenders, Jasmine's release represents the system working as intended. For those who believe that some crimes are unforgivable regardless of the offender's age, it represents a failure to deliver justice to the Richardson family. Jasmine Richardson's case continues to spark debate about juvenile justice and whether children who commit heinous crimes can be rehabilitated. Supporters of the Canadian approach point to research showing that adolescent brains are still developing, that children are more susceptible to peer pressure and manipulation, and that they have greater capacity for change than adults. They argue that writing off a 12-year-old as irredeemable is both cruel and inconsistent with what we know about human development. They note that Jasmine was groomed by an adult predator, that she was barely out of elementary school when she committed the murders, and that she's shown genuine remorse and progress during her treatment. They believe her release demonstrates that rehabilitation is possible, even in the most extreme cases. Critics counter that the brutality of the crimes, 3 murders, including a child, suggests a level of depravity that can't be excused by youth or manipulation. They point out that Jasmine didn't just participate passively, but actively stabbed her own brother. They question whether 10 years of treatment can truly undo whatever psychological factors made her capable of such violence. They argue that the protection of Jasmine's identity adds insult to injury for the victim's family, allowing her to escape the social consequences of her actions while Mark, Deborah, and Jacob remain dead. Both sides have valid points. The truth is that cases like this force us to confront the limits of our justice system and our capacity for both accountability and mercy. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Jasmine Richardson's case is that she's now anonymous. Somewhere in Canada, a woman in her early 30s is living a normal life. She might have a job, she might have friends, she might be in a relationship or even have children. And the people around her have no idea that when she was 12 years old, she helped murder her parents and personally stabbed her 8-year-old brother to death. This anonymity is by design. Canadian law protects young offenders' identities to give them a chance at reintegration, but it creates a profound unease. Someone who committed one of Canada's most notorious family murders is living freely among us, and we have no way of knowing who she is. For the Richardson family and the Medicine Hat community, this is particularly painful. They know that Jasmine is out there, living her life, while Mark, Deborah, and Jacob are gone forever. The Richardson family murders remain one of the most shocking cases in Canadian criminal history. The age of the perpetrators, a 12-year-old girl and her 23-year-old boyfriend, the brutality of the crime, and the subsequent debates about justice and rehabilitation have made it a case that continues to resonate nearly 2 decades later. The case raised important questions about online safety, about predatory relationships between adults and children, about warning signs parents should watch for. Mark and Deborah tried to protect their daughter from Jeremy Steinke. They forbid the relationship. They monitored her online activity. But it wasn't enough. The case also exposed the challenges of the Gothic and alternative subcultures, where vulnerable young people sometimes encounter adults who exploit their rebellion and curiosity. Not everyone in these communities is dangerous, but predators do use them as hunting grounds for victims. Most significantly, the case forced Canada to confront its juvenile justice philosophy. When a 12-year-old commits murder, not in self-defense, not accidentally, but deliberately and with planning, what's the appropriate response? Can such a child be rehabilitated? Should they be? Canada answered yes. Jasmine Richardson served her sentence, completed her treatment, and was released. Whether that was the right decision will be debated for years to come. Mark Richardson was 42 years old. He worked hard to provide for his family. He tried to protect his daughter from a predator. He was stabbed 24 times in his own basement and died trying to keep his family safe. Deborah Richardson was 48 years old. She devoted herself to raising her children. She recognized the danger Jeremy Steinke posed. She died in her bedroom, murdered for trying to keep her 12-year-old daughter away from an adult predator. Jacob Richardson was 8 years old. He loved his family. He trusted his sister. He died in his bed, stabbed by the person he looked up to most in the world. They deserved better. They deserved to live. They deserved justice. Whether they got it is a question each person must answer for themselves. Case 10. Alyssa Bustamante. On the evening of October 21, 2009, 9-year-old Elizabeth Olton asked her mother if she could go outside to play. It was a perfectly ordinary request from a perfectly ordinary little girl in the small town of St. Martins, Missouri, a rural community about 30 miles outside Columbia. Elizabeth's mother said yes. Why wouldn't she? St. Martins was a safe, quiet neighborhood where children played outside until dark, and neighbors looked out for each other. Elizabeth knew not to go far. She'd just be playing in the yards near their home. Elizabeth walked outside into the autumn evening. She never came home. When darkness fell and Elizabeth still hadn't returned, her mother began to panic. She called neighbors, searched the surrounding yards, and eventually called police. By nightfall, the entire community had mobilized. Volunteers, law enforcement, search dogs, all looking for a missing 9-year-old girl. Among the searchers was 15-year-old Alyssa Bustamante, a neighbor who lived just a few houses away. Alyssa joined the search efforts, helping to call Elizabeth's name, looking through the woods and fields, appearing concerned and helpful. But Alyssa knew exactly where Elizabeth was, because hours earlier she'd lured the 9-year-old into the woods, strangled her, slit her throat, stabbed her repeatedly, and buried her body in a grave she'd dug days in advance. Alyssa Bustamante didn't kill Elizabeth Olten because she was angry at her. She didn't kill her because of abuse or trauma or any traditional motive. She killed her for the simplest, most chilling reason imaginable. She wanted to know what it felt like to kill someone. And afterward she wrote in her diary that it was, quote, 0.1. This is the story of a curiosity killing, a murder committed not out of rage or revenge, but out of a teenage girl's desire to experience taking a human life. It's the story of a 9-year-old child who trusted her neighbor and paid for that trust with her life. And it's the story of how warning signs can be screaming at us while we still fail to hear them. Alyssa Bustamante was 15 years old in October 2009, but her childhood had already been marked by instability and trauma. Her biological parents were unable to care for her due to drug problems and other issues, so Alyssa and her younger siblings had been living with their maternal grandparents since she was young. Her grandparents did their best to provide a stable home, but Alyssa struggled. She'd been diagnosed with depression and had a documented history of self-harm. She cut herself, engaged in other self-destructive behaviors, and had made previous suicide attempts. Alyssa was also fascinated with death. She watched videos about murder and violence on YouTube. She researched serial killers. She wrote about death and killing in her diary, expressing curiosity about what it would feel like to take someone's life. These should have been massive red flags. A depressed teenager with a history of self-harm who's openly expressing interest in murder. But Alyssa's family and the mental health professionals working with her seemed to interpret her behavior as typical teenage darkness, perhaps amplified by her depression and difficult background. They didn't recognize or didn't want to recognize that Alyssa wasn't just interested in death abstractly. She was planning to experience it firsthand. Several days before October 21st, 2009, Alyssa went into the woods near her home and dug 2 graves. Not one grave, 2. This detail is crucial because it demonstrates how extensively she'd planned what was coming. Why 2 graves? The most chilling possibility is that she was planning to kill more than one person, or that she wasn't sure which victim would be available when she was ready to act. Another theory is that she dug a practice grave first, then dug the real one. Either way, the pre-dug graves prove this wasn't an impulsive act. Alyssa spent time and effort preparing a burial site for a victim she hadn't yet selected. She thought about measurements, about depth, about concealment. She approached murder the way some people approach a school project, with planning, preparation, and attention to detail. The graves were located in a wooded area not far from where several neighborhood children, including Elizabeth Olten, regularly played. Alyssa knew the area well. She knew children came here. She knew they trusted her. And she waited for the right opportunity. On that Wednesday afternoon, Elizabeth Olten was playing outside near her home. She was 9 years old, a 4th grader who loved her family, enjoyed school, and had her whole life ahead of her. She was the kind of child who trusted adults and older kids who believed that people were basically good, who didn't understand that danger could come from someone familiar. Alyssa saw Elizabeth outside and made her move. She approached the 9-year-old and invited her to come play in the woods. Elizabeth, who knew Alyssa as a neighbor and had no reason to fear her, agreed. They walked together into the woods, Elizabeth probably chattering away, excited to be playing with an older girl. She had no idea what Alyssa had planned, no idea that she was walking toward her death. Once they were deep enough in the woods that no one would hear or see, Alyssa attacked. She strangled Elizabeth, not to unconsciousness, but to death, cutting off the 9-year-old's air supply while Elizabeth struggled and fought for her life. Then Alyssa cut Elizabeth's throat, and then she stabbed her multiple times, ensuring that the child was absolutely, definitely dead. The attack was brutal, sustained, and methodical. This wasn't a single moment of violence. This was a prolonged assault on a helpless 9-year-old who must have been terrified, who must have wondered why someone she trusted was hurting her, who died knowing she'd been betrayed by someone she thought was safe. After Elizabeth was dead, Alyssa dragged her body to one of the pre-dug graves and buried her. She covered the grave with leaves and debris, concealing it from view. Then she calmly walked home. When Alyssa got home after murdering Elizabeth Olten, she went to her room and wrote in her diary. What she wrote would become one of the most infamous pieces of evidence in modern criminal history, a window into the mind of a teenage killer that's both revealing and deeply disturbing. Here's what Alyssa wrote. I just fucking killed someone. I strangled them and slit their throat and stabbed them. Now they're dead. I don't know how to feel ATM. It was amazing. As soon as you get over the, oh my God, I can't do this feeling, it's pretty enjoyable. I'm kind of nervous and shaky though right now. Kay, I gotta go to church now. Lol. Read that again. It was amazing. Pretty enjoyable. Lol. This wasn't a confession written in horror or guilt. This wasn't someone overwhelmed with remorse for what they'd done. This was someone reviewing an experience the way you might review a movie or a new restaurant. The diary entry reveals several chilling things about Alyssa's mindset. First, she'd anticipated having reservations about killing, the quote sixth feeling, and had successfully pushed through them. She'd known it would be difficult emotionally, and she'd prepared herself to overcome normal human empathy. Second, she found the experience positive. These aren't the words of someone who committed murder in a moment of uncontrollable rage. These are the words of someone who enjoyed what they did. Third, she felt comfortable enough with what she'd done to joke about it, quote 9, and to note that she was now heading to church. The juxtaposition is jarring. Murder followed by church attendance. Death followed by, quote, 10 horror, followed by casual dismissal. The diary entry would later be used as devastating evidence against Alyssa. But in the immediate aftermath, no one knew it existed. The diary sat in Alyssa's room, containing her confession, while Elizabeth's family desperately searched for their missing daughter. As soon as Elizabeth's mother realized her daughter was missing, she called police. Within hours, law enforcement had organized a full-scale search effort. Volunteers from the community joined in. Search dogs were brought in. Everyone in the neighborhood mobilized to find the missing 9-year-old. And Alyssa Bustamante joined the search. She walked through the woods calling Elizabeth's name. She talked with searchers about where Elizabeth might be. She appeared concerned and helpful, playing the role of a worried neighbor who wanted to help find the missing child. All while knowing exactly where Elizabeth was, all while having killed her just hours earlier. The ability to participate in the search for a victim you've murdered requires an extraordinary level of psychological detachment. Most people would be unable to maintain that kind of deception. The guilt, the fear of being caught, the horror of what they'd done would be overwhelming. But Alyssa seemed to manage it without difficulty. She inserted herself into the investigation, maintained her composure, and gave no indication that she was responsible for Elizabeth's disappearance. As the search stretched into the night, and then into the next day, investigators began interviewing neighbors and anyone who might have seen Elizabeth. Alyssa's name came up repeatedly. She lived nearby. She was around Elizabeth's age range. She'd been seen outside that afternoon. When police interviewed Alyssa, she initially denied knowing anything about Elizabeth's disappearance. But investigators noticed inconsistencies in her story. They also learned about her history of depression, self-harm, and fascination with death. Most crucially, they obtained a search warrant for Alyssa's home and discovered her diary. The entry about killing someone, written the same day Elizabeth disappeared, was damning. Quote 11. The details matched. The timeline matched. And the casual tone, quote, 12, quote, 13, quote, 14, suggested exactly the kind of person who might kill a 9-year-old out of curiosity. When confronted with the diary entry, Alyssa's story began to fall apart. Under questioning, she eventually confessed. She admitted to luring Elizabeth into the woods. She admitted to strangling, cutting, and stabbing her. She admitted to burying the body in a pre-dug grave, and she led investigators to Elizabeth's body. On October 23, 2009, 2 days after Elizabeth disappeared, Alyssa Bustamante led police to the grave where she'd buried the 9-year-old's body. The grave was in a wooded area not far from both families' homes, concealed under leaves and debris. When investigators uncovered Elizabeth's body, the full horror of what Alyssa had done became clear. Elizabeth had been strangled, her throat had been cut, and she'd been stabbed multiple times. The attack had been vicious and sustained, inflicted on a child who weighed maybe 60 pounds and had no ability to defend herself. The discovery of Elizabeth's body devastated her family and the entire community. Parents who'd let their children play outside in what they thought was a safe neighborhood now had to confront the reality that one of those children was a murderer. That the danger hadn't come from a stranger, but from a teenage girl who lived just a few houses away. Elizabeth's mother had to face the unbearable truth that her 9-year-old daughter had been tortured and killed by someone they knew, someone Elizabeth had trusted, someone who'd pretended to care about finding her while knowing she was dead. In most murder cases, investigators spend significant time establishing motive. Why did the killer want the victim dead? What did they gain from the murder? What drove them to commit such violence? In Alyssa Bustamante's case, the motive was uniquely disturbing. She wanted to know what it felt like to kill someone. This is what's known as a quote 15 or end quote 16, a homicide committed not for traditional reasons like anger, revenge, or financial gain, but simply to experience the act of killing. Alyssa had been fascinated with death and violence for some time. She'd watched videos, read about serial killers, thought about what it would be like to take a life. And eventually, curiosity wasn't enough. She wanted actual experience. She chose Elizabeth as a victim, not because she had anything against the 9-year-old, but because Elizabeth was available, vulnerable, and trusting. Elizabeth was convenient. She was an easy target. She was small enough that Alyssa could overpower her. In Alyssa's mind, Elizabeth wasn't a person with her own hopes, dreams, and future. She was an opportunity to satisfy curiosity, a means to an experience, a way to answer the question, what does it feel like to kill someone? The answer, according to Alyssa's diary, amazing and pretty enjoyable. Alyssa Bustamante was initially charged with first-degree murder. At 15 years old, she faced the possibility of life in prison without parole, if convicted. The case against her was overwhelming. The diary entry, the confession, the pre-dug graves demonstrating premeditation, the forensic evidence linking her to Elizabeth's death. There was no realistic possibility of acquittal. Alyssa's defense attorneys faced a difficult task. How do you defend someone who'd written about enjoying murder in their own diary? How do you generate sympathy for someone who'd killed a 9-year-old out of curiosity and then participated in the search for her body? The defense strategy focused on Alyssa's mental health. They presented evidence of her depression, her self-harm, her suicide attempts. They brought in psychiatric experts who testified about adolescent brain development and impulse control. They argued that while Alyssa's actions were horrific, they were the product of mental illness rather than pure evil. But the prosecution had the diary entry. They had evidence of premeditation, the graves dug days in advance. They had Alyssa's own confession describing in detail how she'd killed Elizabeth. And they had the image of a 9-year-old child who'd been strangled, stabbed, and buried in the woods by someone she trusted. In January 2012, Rather than go to trial, Alyssa pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and armed criminal action. The plea deal likely saved her from a first-degree murder conviction and the possibility of life without parole. At her sentencing hearing in February 2012, the courtroom was packed with Elizabeth's family members, community members, and media. Elizabeth's mother gave a victim impact statement describing the unbearable pain of losing her daughter, the horror of knowing how Elizabeth died, the impossibility of ever understanding why someone would do this. Alyssa was given an opportunity to speak. She offered what sounded like an apology, saying she knew she'd done something terrible and expressing remorse. But her words rang hollow to many who remembered the diary entry, the LOL, the description of murder, as pretty enjoyable. The judge sentenced Alyssa Bustamante to life in prison with the possibility of parole, plus 30 years for armed criminal action. She would be eligible for parole in 2054 when she'd be approximately 60 years old. Alyssa would spend most of her life behind bars for a murder she'd committed at 15 to satisfy her curiosity about what killing felt like. One of the most haunting aspects of the Alyssa Bustamante case is how many warning signs existed before Elizabeth's murder. Alyssa had a documented history of depression and had attempted suicide multiple times. She engaged in self-harm, cutting herself regularly. These behaviors indicated serious mental health issues that required intensive treatment, but more specifically, Alyssa had expressed interest in murder and violence. She wrote about wanting to kill in her diary, not in vague, metaphorical terms, but in specific, concerning ways. She watched videos about murder and death on YouTube. She researched serial killers. In her diary before Elizabeth's murder, Alyssa had written entries expressing curiosity about what it would feel like to kill someone. She'd fantasized about it, thought about it, prepared mentally for it. All of these things should have been red flags, but they were either not noticed, not reported to the right people, or not taken seriously enough to prevent tragedy. Alyssa's grandparents were aware of her depression and self-harm. She was receiving some mental health treatment, but somehow the combination of self-destructive behavior and homicidal ideation didn't trigger the level of intervention that might have saved Elizabeth's life. This is one of the great tragedies of the case. Elizabeth Olten's death might have been preventable if the warning signs had been properly recognized and acted upon. The Alyssa Bustamante case occurred in 2009, still relatively early in the social media era. Alyssa had a presence on YouTube and other platforms where she posted videos and content related to her interests. Some of this content was concerning, videos about death, violence, and murder, comments expressing dark thoughts, the kind of content that, in retrospect, clearly indicated someone with unhealthy fascinations. But in 2009, parents and mental health professionals were still learning how to monitor and interpret teenagers' online behavior. The warning signs that might seem obvious now, a depressed teenager posting videos about murder, weren't necessarily recognized as urgent red flags at the time. The case raised important questions about how we monitor at-risk teenagers' online activity, what responsibilities social media platforms have to flag concerning content, and how parents and professionals can distinguish between normal teenage darkness and genuine danger signals. Since 2009, awareness has increased. We're better at recognizing online warning signs of potential violence, but we're still not perfect, and teenagers with homicidal ideation still sometimes slip through the cracks. The murder of Elizabeth Olten shattered the small community of St. Martins, Missouri. This was a place where children played outside until dark, where neighbors knew each other, where people felt safe. The revelation that a 15-year-old neighbor girl had murdered a 9-year-old child destroyed that sense of safety. Parents who'd let their children play freely in the neighborhood now kept them inside. People who'd trusted their neighbors now looked at everyone with suspicion. The fact that Elizabeth had been lured by someone she knew and trusted made it even worse. Parents couldn't protect their children by teaching them about stranger danger. The danger had come from within the community, from someone familiar. Elizabeth's family had to continue living in a neighborhood where their daughter had been murdered, where they'd searched frantically for her while her killer pretended to help. The trauma of that experience is almost unimaginable. The community held vigils, memorial services, and fundraisers for Elizabeth's family. They came together in their grief, but the fundamental sense of safety and innocence was gone, replaced by the knowledge that evil could come from the most unexpected places. Alyssa Bustamante is currently serving her sentence in a Missouri prison. She's now in her early 30s, having spent her entire adult life incarcerated for a murder she committed as a teenager. Little is publicly known about her life in prison. Unlike some high-profile cases where inmates give interviews or maintain public profiles, Alyssa has largely disappeared from public view. Has she expressed genuine remorse for what she did? Has she undergone psychological treatment that's addressed whatever led her to kill Elizabeth? Has she become a different person than the 15-year-old who wrote "amazing" and "lol" after murdering a 9-year-old? We don't know. And we won't know until 2054, when she becomes eligible for parole. At that parole hearing, if she lives to see it, Alyssa will be approximately 60 years old. She'll have spent 45 years in prison. The parole board will have to decide whether the woman sitting before them is still dangerous, whether she's been rehabilitated, whether she deserves a chance at freedom. They'll have to weigh her age at the time of the crime, 15 years old, technically still a child, against the brutality of what she did and the chilling lack of remorse she expressed afterward. It's impossible to predict what decision they'll make. Elizabeth Olten was 9 years old when she died. She was a fourth grader who loved her family and enjoyed the simple pleasures of childhood. She trusted people. She believed her neighbors were safe. She thought an older girl inviting her to play was just being nice. She was wrong, and she paid for that trust with her life. Elizabeth should be in her mid-20s now. She should have graduated high school, maybe gone to college, started a career. She should have fallen in love, maybe gotten married, possibly had children of her own. She should have had decades of life experiences, of joys and sorrows, of the ordinary and extraordinary moments that make up a human life. Instead, she died terrified and in pain in the woods near her home, murdered by someone she trusted, denied the chance to grow up. Her family created memorial funds in her name. They've spoken publicly about her life and death, trying to ensure that Elizabeth is remembered as more than just a victim, more than just the 9-year-old who was killed by her neighbor. But the tragedy remains. Elizabeth Olten is dead, and no amount of justice, no length of prison sentence for her killer can bring her back. The word amazing, Alyssa's misspelling of, quote, 24 row in her diary entry, has become infamous. It's cited in true crime documentaries, articles, and discussions as evidence of how chillingly detached some killers can be from the enormity of their crimes. It was amazing. As soon as you get over the "oh my God, I can't do this" feeling, it's pretty enjoyable. These words, more than anything else about the case, capture the horror of what Alyssa did. Not just that she killed Elizabeth, but that she enjoyed it, that she reviewed the experience positively, that she treated murder as an interesting experiment rather than the destruction of a human life. The diary entry ensures that Alyssa Bustamante will never be seen as just another troubled teenager who made a terrible mistake. She'll always be the girl who killed for curiosity, and described it as, quote, 26, quote, "The Alyssa Bustamante case leaves us with difficult questions that have no satisfying answers. Could Elizabeth's death have been prevented? Almost certainly yes. If Alyssa's fascination with murder had been taken more seriously, if her diary entries had been discovered earlier, if intervention had been more intensive. But recognizing and preventing violence before it happens is extraordinarily difficult, especially with teenagers whose brains are still developing and whose thoughts are often dark without being dangerous. Was Alyssa born without empathy, or did her difficult childhood and mental health issues create someone capable of murder? We don't know. Nature versus nurture debates are especially complicated in cases involving adolescents. Will she ever be safe to release? That's the question the parole board will face in 2054. Will someone who killed a 9-year-old at age 15, who described it as, quote, 27, quote, who showed such profound lack of empathy, will that person, after 45 years in prison, be rehabilitated enough to rejoin society? And perhaps the most painful question, why Elizabeth? She was just a 9-year-old playing outside. She'd done nothing wrong. She was simply available when Alyssa decided to satisfy her curiosity about killing. The randomness of it, the fact that Elizabeth died not because of anything she did, but simply because she was convenient, makes it even more tragic. Alyssa Bustamante remains in prison, serving her life sentence. Elizabeth Olten remains dead, forever 9 years old. And the community of St. Martin's, Missouri, continues to carry the weight of a tragedy that shattered their sense of safety and innocence. The case serves as a stark reminder that danger can come from the most unexpected sources, that warning signs, even when they're present, aren't always recognized in time. That curiosity combined with lack of empathy can be deadly, and that sometimes the answer to what does it feel like to kill someone comes at a cost that's unimaginable, the destruction of an innocent life, the devastation of a family, and the permanent loss of whatever humanity the killer had left. Elizabeth Olten deserved to grow up. She deserved decades of life. She deserved better than to be the victim in a curiosity killing, reduced to an experiment for a teenager who wanted to know what murder felt like. But what she deserved and what she got are two very different things. And that's the unbearable injustice at the heart of this case. These 10 cases paint a disturbing picture of teenage girls who chose murder when other options existed. They chose to kill parents, grandparents, family members who loved them, who tried to help them, who stood in the way of what they wanted. Some killed for freedom. Some killed for money. Some killed out of rage or resentment, or under the influence of drugs. Some had boyfriends who encouraged the violence. Some had trauma that made them more volatile. Some simply hated the people they lived with. But in every case, there was a moment, a split second between anger and action, where they could have made a different choice. They could have run away. They could have called for help. They could have waited until they turned 18 and left on their own terms. They didn't. They chose murder. And now the families they destroyed will never be whole again. These stories force us to confront uncomfortable questions about teenage violence, family dynamics, mental health, and justice. They challenge our assumptions about who's capable of murder and who deserves our sympathy. And they remind us that sometimes the most dangerous person in your life is the one you're trying to save. These 10 cases span 3 decades and 2 countries, yet they share haunting commonalities. Whether 12 years old or 17, whether motivated by romantic obsession, escape from abuse, financial greed, or inexplicable darkness, each girl chose violence over every other option. They destroyed not just their parents and siblings, but the fundamental trust that binds families. Some showed immediate remorse. Others displayed chilling indifference. Some were clearly victims who became perpetrators. Others were calculating predators in children's bodies. The question isn't whether we can understand what drove them. It's whether understanding matters when mothers beg for their lives, when toddlers are stabbed in their sleep, when 8-year-olds' final words are pleas for mercy. What these cases demand isn't just justice, but vigilance, to recognize warning signs, to address mental health before tragedy strikes, and to remember that in every statistic of a family annihilation, real people died trusting those who killed them. Which of these cases disturbed you the most? Do you believe teenage girls who murder their families deserve rehabilitation, or should age not matter when the crime is this horrific? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this documentary informative, please like and subscribe for more true crime content that examines the darkest corners of human behavior.